Hey everyone, welcome back to Nightmare Tales. Before you settle in and drift off, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from. If you're loving these chilling stories, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Now, let's unwind and dive into tonight's intriguing case. The chalet's isolation should have been our first warning. Sarah had found it online. A steal, she'd said, practically giving it away for a week in the Colorado Rockies. The photographs showed a rustic A-frame nestled among towering pines with views that stretched endlessly across snow-dusted peaks. What the photos didn't capture was the oppressive silence that seemed to press against the windows like something alive, or how the shadows between the trees moved wrong in your peripheral vision. We arrived just as dusk painted the sky the color of old blood. The key was under a ceramic frog by the front steps, exactly where the owner had promised. Sarah laughed at the quirky little guardian, but I noticed how its painted eyes seemed to track our movements as we hauled our luggage inside. The interior smelled of cedar and something else, something stale and medicinal that caught in the back of my throat. The first 3 days passed without incident. We hiked the marked trails, cooked elaborate meals in the surprisingly well-equipped kitchen, and made love by the stone fireplace while wind howled through the pines outside. Sarah seemed more relaxed than she'd been in months, the stress lines around her eyes finally smoothing. I should have been grateful for this reprieve from our city lives, but something nagged at me. A persistent itch between my shoulder blades, the feeling of being observed through windows that reflected only darkness. It started on Thursday night at exactly 9 o'clock. I was washing dishes while Sarah browsed through the collection of paperback mysteries someone had left on the mantelpiece. The warm soapy water felt good on my hands, and I'd been lost in the meditative rhythm of scrubbing when I heard it. The distinctive metallic squeak of the back door handle being turned. My hands froze in the sudsy water. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate rotation followed by the subtle pressure of someone testing the door against its frame. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. After what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, the pressure released. Footsteps, or what might have been footsteps, retreated across the back deck. I dried my hands and called Sarah's name, trying to keep my voice level. She looked up from her book with raised eyebrows, and I explained what I'd heard. Together, we checked the back door, finding it securely locked, the handle cold beneath my palm. Outside, the deck showed no signs of disturbance in the thin layer of snow that had fallen that afternoon. Sarah suggested it might have been a deer or elk brushing against the door. The explanation felt reasonable in the warm glow of the living room, with her hand in mine and the fire crackling peacefully. But when I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling beams that looked like ribs in the darkness, I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. It had been too deliberate, too human. The next evening, I waited. At 8:55, I positioned myself by the kitchen window with a clear view of the back door. Sarah was reading in the living room, unaware of my vigil. The minutes crawled by with excruciating slowness. At exactly 9 o'clock, the handle moved. This time, I saw it clearly. The brass lever depressed smoothly, held for several seconds, then released. No shadowy figure was visible through the glass. No silhouette against the snow, just the handle moving as if turned by invisible hands. I watched transfixed as the motion repeated twice more before stopping. When I blinked, my reflection stared back from the black window, pale and hollow-eyed. I said nothing to Sarah that night, but sleep evaded me completely. I kept thinking about the methodical nature of the movements. 3 attempts, always at the same time, always with the same careful precision. By morning, I'd convinced myself I was overtired, seeing things that weren't there. Mountain air could play tricks on the mind, couldn't it? But it happened again Saturday night and Sunday. Each time at exactly 9 o'clock, each time with the same ritualistic precision on Monday morning, while Sarah slept in, I walked to the nearest neighbor's house, a weathered cabin about a 4-mile down the mountain road. An elderly man named Frank answered my knock. His face was deeply lined, carved by decades of mountain weather, and his eyes held the sharp alertness of someone who'd spent years watching the wilderness. When I mentioned the chalet we were renting, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally nodding as if none of this surprised him. When I finished, He was quiet for a long moment, staring past me toward the pine-covered slopes. Frank told me he'd noticed someone around the back of our chalet several times over the past year, always around 9 o'clock in the evening. He described seeing a figure near what he called that old brass handle on the back door, the fancy Victorian one with all the scroll work. His description puzzled me because our door handle was simple and modern, just a standard lever in brushed steel. My next stop was a small house where an artist lived with her husband. The woman, Elena, had a studio in her converted garage and spent her evenings painting by large windows that faced our direction. She'd definitely seen someone at our back door. She said multiple times over the last several months. But when she described the handle, she spoke of an ornate iron piece, real old-fashioned with that distinctive ring-shaped grip. The inconsistency bothered me, but I pressed on to the third neighbor, a middle-aged couple who lived in a modern log home closer to the main road. The husband, Dale, confirmed the sightings, but described our door handle as one of those antique crystal knobs, the kind they used in fancy houses back in the day, clear glass with those beveled edges that catch the light. 3 neighbors, 3 completely different descriptions of our door handle. Each account was given with absolute certainty, as if they were describing something they'd observed countless times. That afternoon, while Sarah napped, I examined our back door with new attention. The handle was exactly what I'd thought, a contemporary brushed steel lever, probably installed within the last 5 years. Nothing Victorian, nothing iron, nothing crystal. I ran my fingers over its smooth surface, searching for any detail I might have missed, but it remained stubbornly ordinary. The paranoia began that evening as we prepared dinner. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the back door, studying that handle with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Sarah noticed my distraction and asked if I was feeling all right. I deflected, claiming the altitude was getting to me, but her concerned look lingered. At 9 o'clock, I positioned myself again by the window. This time, Sarah joined me, curious about my nightly ritual. When the handle moved, she saw it, too. Her sharp intake of breath confirmed I wasn't losing my mind. But somehow that offered no comfort. If anything, having a witness made it worse, more real, more impossible to rationalize away. We spent the next day in town deliberately staying away from the chalet until late afternoon. But even surrounded by normal people doing normal things, buying groceries, browsing antique shops, eating lunch at a diner, I couldn't escape the image of that handle turning in empty air. Every brass fixture, every door lever, every knob seemed to mock me with its ordinary stillness. Sarah suggested we cut the vacation short, head home early. The idea tempted me, but something stubborn in me refused to be driven away by whatever game was being played. That evening, I convinced her to stay one more night. I needed to understand what was happening. Needed some kind of resolution that would let me sleep again. It was while browsing the chalet's kitchen cabinets for coffee filters that I found the first one. Tucked behind a stack of mismatched dishes was an ornate brass handle exactly matching Frank's description. Victorian scroll work. Elaborate detailing, the patina of age darkening its curves. My hands trembled as I lifted it from its hiding place. It was heavier than expected, warm to the touch despite the cool air. How long had it been there? Why was it hidden? The discovery sent me on a frantic search through the chalet. In the bedroom closet, wrapped in an old towel, I found Elena's iron handle with its distinctive ring grip. The crystal knob Dale had described was in the bathroom cabinet, nestled among spare toiletries like some precious artifact. 3 handles, 3 exact matches to the neighbors' descriptions, all hidden throughout the house we'd been living in for a week. I sat on the living room floor, the handles arranged before me like evidence in some incomprehensible crime. Each one felt different under my fingers. The brass warm and slightly oily, the iron cold and rough, the crystal smooth as ice. They were undeniably real, undeniably there, but their presence made no sense. When had they been hidden? Who had put them there? And why did 3 different people see 3 different handles on our door? Sarah found me there an hour later, still staring at the collection. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. A step backward as if the handles were dangerous. She wanted to know where I'd found them, why I'd been searching through the house. Her questions came rapid fire, tinged with an edge I'd never heard in her voice before. I tried to explain, but the words sounded insane even to me. 3 neighbors, 3 different handles, all now sitting in front of us like some impossible proof of what? I couldn't even articulate what I thought they proved. Sarah's face grew pale as I spoke, and she kept glancing toward the back door as if expecting something to materialize. 9 o'clock approached with agonizing slowness. We both watched the back door now, our attention focused with laser intensity on that ordinary steel handle. At exactly 9, it moved. But this time, something was different. Instead of the familiar brass lever I'd been watching all week, I saw ornate scrollwork. Sarah gasped, and I knew she was seeing something different again. When I blinked, it was iron. Another blink, crystal. The handle shifted between versions with each movement of my eyes, never settling on one form, as if reality itself couldn't decide which version was true. Sarah was crying now. Soft, desperate sounds that cut through the silence. She was seeing the changes, too. And the shared madness somehow made it worse rather than better. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in the living room watching the back door, waiting for 9 o'clock to come around again. When it did, the transformation was even more pronounced. The entire door seemed to flicker between versions of itself. Sometimes modern with steel hardware, sometimes heavy oak with brass fittings, sometimes painted white with that crystal knob gleaming like a captured star. The worst part was the sound. Not just the turning of the handle, but what came after. Footsteps on the deck, yes, but also the creak of hinges that didn't match our door. The soft whisper of someone breathing just beyond the glass. The almost inaudible scratch of fingernails against wood. Layer upon layer of sound, as if multiple realities were bleeding through at once. By morning, we'd made our decision. We packed quickly, barely speaking, moving with the urgent efficiency of people fleeing a disaster. As I loaded our bags into the car, I took one last look at the back door. In the bright morning sunlight, it appeared completely normal. Steel handle, modern frame, nothing unusual about it at all. The 3 handles I'd found were still sitting on the coffee table where we'd left them, solid and undeniable. We drove away without looking back, but the image of that door followed us down the mountain. Now, 3 weeks later, I can't stop thinking about those handles. They're in my apartment now. I couldn't bring myself to leave them behind. Sarah hasn't spoken to me since we got home. She won't return my calls, won't answer my texts. When I drove by her place yesterday, I saw new locks on her door. Strong ones, expensive ones. Last night, I heard the sound again. At exactly 9 o'clock, the familiar squeak of a handle being turned. But I live in a 5th-floor apartment with no back door, no deck, nothing but a sheer drop to the parking lot below. I checked every door in my apartment, front door, bathroom, closets, everything. All secure, all locked. But this morning, I found a 4th handle. It was sitting on my kitchen counter. Polished wood with inlaid silver details. Beautiful and impossible and absolutely not something I owned. I've never seen anything like it before. Yet, it feels familiar in my hands. As if I've been turning it my entire life. As if I've been the one trying doors at 9 o'clock, testing locks, searching for the right combination of handle and door and moment that will finally let me in or let something else out. I keep thinking about what Frank said about seeing someone at the back door over the past year. Elena's sightings going back months. Dale's confident description of details that didn't exist. How long had this been happening before we arrived? How many others had stayed in that chalet and heard the same sounds, seen the same impossible transformations? And how many of them had brought something back with them when they left? Tonight, I'm going to wait by my front door at 9 o'clock. I've arranged the 4 handles on the floor beside me. Brass, iron, crystal, and wood. When the time comes, when I hear that familiar sound of someone testing the lock, I'm going to try each handle in turn. One of them has to fit. One of them has to be the key to understanding what's happening to me. Sarah was right to change her locks. I know that now. Whatever followed us down from the mountain, whatever attached itself to us during those nights of watching and waiting, it's still here. It's still trying doors. Still looking for the right combination. The perfect match. The clock on my wall reads 858. Almost time. I can hear something moving in the hallway outside my apartment. Soft footsteps that stop just beyond my door. My hands are shaking as I reach for the first handle. The brass one feels warm, almost alive, as if it's been waiting for this moment. The doorknob turns. Story 2. The sheets never wrinkled at Grandma Ruth's house. I discovered this 3 nights into my stay at her old country place. A Victorian relic she'd left me in her will, along with debts I couldn't afford and memories I'd rather forget. The fabric design work that had consumed my life in Chicago felt meaningless now, reduced to pixels on a screen that couldn't compete with the weight of inherited grief and the strange peace of rural Missouri. Moonlight filtered through gauze curtains, casting everything in silver-gray shadows that shifted with each breeze. The bed itself was ancient, a 4-poster mahogany monstrosity with a mattress that had probably seen 3 generations of births, deaths, and sleepless nights like the ones I'd been having. It was the insomnia that made me notice at first. I'd been lying there, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked disturbingly like a reaching hand when I heard the sound. Soft, rhythmic, like fabric being pulled taut and smoothed with careful, deliberate strokes. The noise came from somewhere near my feet, and when I lifted my head to look, the sheet covering me was perfectly flat, creaseless, as if invisible hands had just finished pressing it with meticulous care. The second night, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Grief does strange things to perception, I told myself. The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds meaning in meaningless sounds. I'd read about this phenomenon in one of those psychology articles I'd bookmarked but never truly absorbed. Pareidolia, they called it, seeing faces in clouds, hearing voices in static, finding ghosts in creaking wood and settling foundations. But the third night, I was ready. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing until it matched the rhythm of the old house settling around me. Outside, wind moved through the oak trees with a sound like whispered conversations. And somewhere in the walls, pipes groaned with the weight of decades. The digital clock beside the bed glowed. 3:17 a.m. when it started again. The sheet at my feet began to lift, rising as if gentle fingers were grasping its edge. It hovered there for a moment, suspended in air that felt suddenly thick and charged with invisible electricity. Then it descended, smoothing itself with that same careful, methodical precision I'd heard before. The fabric moved in waves, each fold disappearing as if pressed by an expertress who'd spent a lifetime perfecting her technique. My heart hammered against my ribs as I watched the process repeat itself across the entire surface of the sheet. Starting at the foot of the bed, the invisible presence worked its way upward, smoothing, straightening, creating perfect hospital corners that Ruth would have admired. The fabric never once disturbed my position beneath it, somehow flowing around my body like water while maintaining its supernatural precision. When it reached my chest, I stopped breathing entirely. Whatever was doing this paused as if sensing my awareness. The sheet hung motionless above me, close enough that I could feel the displacement of air against my face. In that moment of suspension, I swear I caught a scent. Lavender soap and something else, something familiar yet impossible to place. It reminded me of Sunday mornings when I was 7, of Ruth bustling around the same room, preparing fresh linens while humming hymns under her breath. The memory hit me with physical force, and I gasped involuntarily. The sheet dropped immediately, settling over me in natural folds and wrinkles, as if the mysterious presence had vanished the instant I betrayed my awareness. I lay there for hours afterward, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, but nothing else happened. Dawn eventually crept through the curtains, bringing with it the rational light of day and a dozen logical explanations for what I'd experienced. Temperature fluctuations. I decided old houses were notorious for uneven heating and cooling. Air currents could create the illusion of movement, especially with lightweight fabrics. The human brain, already compromised by grief and isolation, was predisposed to interpret mundane phenomena as supernatural events. I'd spent too many years designing patterns and textures not to understand how the eye could be fooled, how suggestion could override perception. But the fourth night, logic abandoned me entirely. I'd tried sleeping on the couch downstairs, but the unfamiliar sounds of the lower floor, creaking boards, settling beams, the rhythmic tick of Ruth's grandfather clock proved even more unsettling than the bedroom's mysterious visitor. By midnight, I'd climb the stairs again, drawn back to that four-poster bed like a moth to flame. This time, I made a decision that would haunt me for years to come. Instead of lying beneath the sheets, I arranged the bedding to suggest my presence, then positioned myself on the hardwood floor beside the bed. From this vantage point, I'd be able to observe whatever was happening without interfering with the process. The floor was uncomfortable, cold against my back, but it offered something the bed couldn't. A clear view of the entire phenomenon. The weight felt eternal. My spine HDHD against the unforgiving wood, and dust motes danced in the moonlight streaming through the windows. Every sound seemed amplified. My own breathing, the house settling, a distant train whistle that carried across the Missouri countryside like a mournful ghost. At 3:17 a.m. exactly it began. The sheet rose at the foot of the bed, lifting with that same gentle, purposeful motion I'd observed before. But now, from my position on the floor, I could see more than just the fabric's movement. I could see the depression it made as invisible fingers gripped its edge. The way the mattress dimmed slightly under unseen weight as whatever was doing this positioned itself for better leverage. My mouth went dry as I watched the presence work its way around the bed, straightening corners, smoothing wrinkles with an expertise that spoke of decades of practice. There was love in these movements, I realized with growing terror. Devotion, the kind of care that only comes from tending to someone you cherish beyond measure. As the invisible figure moved to the head of the bed, directly into my line of sight, the air began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. The distortion was subtle at first, barely perceptible, but it gradually intensified until I could make out the vague outline of a hunched form. Small, elderly, moving with the deliberate slowness of arthritic joints and failing strength. The shape paused in its work, and I felt the weight of attention settle over me like a suffocating blanket. Though I couldn't see eyes, I knew with absolute certainty that I was being observed, studied, perhaps even recognized. The air in the room grew thick and oppressive, charged with emotions I couldn't name but felt in my bones. Longing, sadness, and something that might have been disappointment. When the presence spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere. A whisper that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my skull. "You're not sleeping properly." The words were so mundane, so achingly familiar that tears sprang to my eyes before I could stop them. How many times had Ruth said those exact words during my childhood visits? How many mornings had she fussed over my appearance, smoothing my hair and straightening my clothes before sending me off to play in her garden? "You never did take care of yourself." The voice continued, tinged with the same gentle reproach I remembered from decades past. "Look at you now, sleeping on the floor like some vagrant. This won't do it all." The shimmering intensified, and for just a moment, I thought I could see her clearly. Ruth, as I remembered her, in her 70s, silver hair pinned in a neat bun, wearing the faded blue housecoat she'd favored for morning chores. Her hands, spotted with age, but still strong, continued their methodical work on the bed sheets. "Grandma." The word escaped my lips before I could stop it. The figure still stilled. In the sudden silence, I became aware of my own ragged breathing. The way my heart was trying to pound its way out of my chest. The moonlight seemed to dim as if clouds had passed over its face. And the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said. And now it carried an undertone of something darker, something that made my skin crawl. "Not like this, not watching." The sheet billowed upward, then settled with unnatural slowness, and I realized that the presence was no longer focused on its task. Its attention had shifted entirely to me, and the quality of that attention had changed. Where before there had been love and concern, now there was something else. Possessiveness perhaps, or anger at being observed in its private ritual. "I take care of this room," the voice whispered, and each word seemed to leach warmth from the air around me. "I've always taken care of this room. Since before you were born, I've been making sure everything is perfect. Everything is ready for when you come home." The implications of those words hit me like a physical blow. How long had she been doing this? How long had Ruth, or whatever remained of Ruth, been preparing this bed night after night, waiting for visits that came less and less frequently as I'd grown older and more absorbed in my own life? But you didn't come, the voice continued, growing stronger now, more distinct. Birthdays passed, Christmases. I kept waiting, kept preparing. The sheets were always fresh, always perfect, just in case. Guilt crashed over me in waves. I'd been so busy with work, so consumed with building my career and my life in Chicago that I'd let months pass between phone calls, years between visits. Ruth had grown old and died in this house while I'd been designing logos for companies I didn't care about, dating people whose names I could barely remember, building a life that felt hollow now in comparison to the love I'd carelessly abandoned. "I'm sorry," I whispered and meant it with every fiber of my being. The shimmering figure moved closer to the edge of the bed, and I could feel its presence like a cold pressure against my skin. "Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't bring back time." The sheet rose again, but this time its movement was aggressive, angry. It snapped in the air like a flag in a strong wind, and I scrambled backward across the floor, suddenly terrified of what might happen if that fabric touched me. The temperature in the room continued to drop and frost began forming on the windows despite the mild October weather outside. "You want to watch?" the voice hissed, losing all pretense of the gentle grandmother I remembered. "Then watch closely. See what you abandoned. See what you left to die alone." The sheet began to fold itself, but not in the careful, loving manner I'd observed before. Now it twisted and writhed, forming shapes that hurt to look at. Configurations that suggested suffering and endless feudal waiting. The fabric seemed to tell a story of nights spent listening for footsteps that never came, of holidays celebrated alone, of a bed prepared with infinite care for a grandson who couldn't be bothered to visit. I closed my eyes, but the images continued behind my eyelids, projected directly into my consciousness by whatever force was inhabiting this room. I saw Ruth in her final years, moving through these same motions night after night, smoothing sheets that no one would sleep on, preparing a room that no one would occupy. I felt her loneliness like a physical weight, her hope curdling into resentment as seasons passed, and I remained absent. "Look at me," the voice commanded. And against my will, my eyes opened. The shimmering had coalesced into something almost solid now. A figure that was unmistakably Ruth, but wrong in subtle ways that made my mind recoil. Her familiar features were there, but sharper somehow, etched with bitterness and endless patience. Her eyes, which I remembered as warm brown, now gleamed with an inner light that belonged to neither the living nor the peacefully dead. "This is what love becomes," she said, gesturing to the perfectly arranged bed, to the room that had been maintained in pristine condition despite having no living occupant. "This is what devotion looks like when it has nowhere to go. It doesn't die. It just grows stronger and hungrier and more desperate." I wanted to run to flee this room and this house and never look back. But my body felt lead, pinned to the floor by the weight of guilt and the strange magnetic pull of the presence before me. Part of me, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, was fascinated by this manifestation of love turned toxic. This demonstration of what happens when care becomes compulsion. "Every night," she continued, moving around the bed with mechanical precision. "I prepare this room every night for 5 years since my body gave out because that's what love does. It persists. It finds a way." The sheet rose and fell with hypnotic rhythm and I found myself entranced despite my terror. There was something beautiful in the perfection of her movements, in the absolute dedication to a task that served no living purpose. It was love in its purest, most distilled form. Selfless, devoted, and completely divorced from any expectation of return. "But now you're here," she said, and her voice carried a note of satisfaction that chilled me to my core. "Finally here, just as I always knew you would be. The room is ready. It's always been ready." The implications of her words sank in slowly. This wasn't just about watching some supernatural housekeeping ritual. This was about fulfillment, about the completion of a pattern that had been repeating for years. I was here now in the house in this room. The bed was prepared. The cycle was ready to be completed. "No," I whispered, finally understanding. "I can't. I won't." "Sleep," she said, and the command carried weight that seemed to press down on my eyelids. "Sleep in the bed I've prepared for you. Let me take care of you the way I always wanted to. Let me tuck you in properly this time." My body began to feel heavy, sluggish, as if I was sinking into deep water. The hardwood floor beneath me softened somehow, becoming less substantial, and I realized with growing panic that I was losing the ability to distinguish between physical reality and whatever realm Ruth now inhabited. Fighting against the supernatural compulsion, I forced myself to focus on concrete details. The grain of the wood beneath my hands, the sound of my own breathing, the weight of my body against the floor. These anchors to reality felt tenuous, but they kept me from succumbing entirely to the presence's influence. "I can't stay here," I managed to say, each word a struggle against the drowsiness that was settling over me like fog. "This isn't healthy for either of us." Ruth's figure wavered, becoming less distinct, and for a moment, I thought I heard something like a sob. "You're all I have left, all I've ever had. Don't you understand? Without you, there's nothing. Just emptiness and sheets that never need straightening because nobody sleeps in them." The raw anguish in her voice cut through my fear, replacing it with something more complex and painful. This wasn't just about supernatural horror. It was about love that had nowhere to go. Care that had been lavished on empty rooms and imagined occupants. Ruth had spent her final years preparing for visits that never came. And my sheets are always perfectly smooth. Story 3. The intercom's harsh buzz cut through my apartment like a rusty blade at 11:47 p.m. just as I was closing the last debugging session of the night. The sound made me flinch, sending my coffee mug clattering against the keyboard. In 3 years of living in this building, no one had ever used the front entrance intercom after 9 o'clock. I pushed back from my desk, the rolling chair squeaking against the silence that had settled back over my apartment. The fluorescent light above my workstation hummed its familiar tune, casting everything in that clinical white glow that had become the backdrop to my insomnia. Outside, Seattle's rain drummed against the windows with its usual persistence. But something felt different tonight. The rhythm seemed off, like a song played slightly too slow. The intercom buzzed again. My bare feet found the cold hardwood as I padded toward the device mounted near my front door. The building's intercom system was ancient, installed sometime in the 80s, all crackling speakers and fuzzy video monitors. I'd complained to the landlord countless times about replacing it. But Mr. Chen always found more pressing maintenance issues. I pressed the talk button, expecting to hear Mrs. Rodriguez from 3B complaining about noise. Or maybe Jimmy from downstairs locked out again after another late shift. Marcus, the voice that emerged from the speaker, made my blood freeze. Clear as daylight, unmistakable despite the static, my brother's voice. But Daniel was in Prague. Had been for 8 months now working on some software architecture project for a European firm. We'd Skyped just last Tuesday. He'd shown me the view from his apartment window. The Charles Bridge stretching across the dark water of the Volulta River. He'd complained about the coffee, asked about Mom, promised to call again soon. My finger hesitated over the response button. The rational part of my mind, the part that debugged code for a living, that lived in logic and systematic thinking, immediately began generating explanations. Wrong address. Someone with a similar voice, a prank, technical malfunction. But the voice had been so clear, so distinctly Daniel's, with that slight upturn at the end that made even statements sound like questions. The way he'd said my name carried the same familiar weight it had carried since we were kids. Daniel. I spoke into the intercom, my voice cracking slightly. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the persistent static and the sound of rain against glass. Then, "Can you buzz me up? I'm soaked." The word sent electricity down my spine. That was Daniel. Always practical, always focused on immediate problems, but the timing was impossible. Even if he'd caught a red-eye flight from Prague, he would have called. He would have told me he was coming. My thumb moved toward the door release button, then stopped. Through the intercom's tiny black and white monitor, I could see the building's front entrance. The camera was positioned at an angle that showed most of the covered entryway, though the image quality was terrible, grainy, and washed out with several dead pixels creating permanent dark spots across the screen. A figure stood there, hunched against what appeared to be heavy rain. The shape was familiar. Daniel's height, his broad shoulders, the way he stood with his weight shifted slightly to his left foot. But something was wrong with the image. The person's clothes looked disheveled, and there was an odd quality to the lighting that I couldn't quite place. Daniel, what are you doing here? Why didn't you call? The figure on the monitor moved slightly, raising what looked like a hand to wave. My phone died on the plane. Come on, Marcus. I'm freezing out here. The explanation made sense, but my unease was growing rather than diminishing. I stared at the monitor, trying to make out more details through the poor resolution. The person's suit, it was definitely a suit Daniel's style, looked wrong somehow, torn maybe, or badly wrinkled, and the lighting around the figure seemed off, as if the shadows were falling in directions that didn't match the building's exterior lights. I realized I was holding my breath. Why are you here? I asked. I thought you were in Prague until November. The static seemed to intensify for a moment. And when Daniel's voice came through again, it sounded slightly different. Still him, but with an edge I couldn't identify. Project got cancelled. I'll explain everything upstairs. Please, Marcus. My finger moved toward the button again. This was my brother. Even if the timing was strange, even if something felt off, this was Daniel asking for help. We'd always been there for each other, especially after Dad died and Mom started her slow retreat into whatever private world grief had built for her. But as I leaned closer to the monitor, trying to get a better look at the figure outside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The rain around the building's entrance was falling upward. Not all of it. That would have been too obvious, too impossible to rationalize away. But scattered droplets caught in the monitor's grainy black and white display were clearly moving in the wrong direction, falling up toward the sky instead of down toward the earth. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes. Long hours staring at code had given me problems before. Eye strain, double vision, the occasional migraine. I looked at the monitor again. The rain was falling normally now, down as rain should fall. Marcus. Daniel's voice carried a note of impatience. Are you going to let me up or not? I pressed the talk button again, my mouth dry. How do I know it's really you? A pause, then what sounded almost like a laugh, but not quite. Come on, man. Who else would it be? The question hung in the air like smoke. Who else indeed? But the wrongness I felt was growing stronger, spreading through my chest like cold water. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to press that button, not to let whatever was outside into the building. Tell me something only Daniel would know, I said. Another pause, longer this time. On the monitor, the figure remained motionless, a dark shape against the grainy background. You have a scar on your left shoulder from when we were building that treehouse. The voice finally said, you fell off the ladder and landed on a broken beer bottle. The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 11. Daniel was 14. We'd been working on the treehouse for weeks using wood scraps Dad had brought home from construction sites. I'd been showing off, trying to prove I could handle the same work as my older brother. The fall, the sharp pain, the way Daniel had gone pale at the sight of blood soaking through my t-shirt. Mom driving us to the emergency room while Daniel held a towel against my shoulder, whispering apologies the entire way. It was exactly the kind of memory Daniel would reference, specific enough to be convincing, shared enough between us to be meaningful. And yet, the scar is on my right shoulder, I said. Silence. Long stretching silence filled with static and the sound of rain. When Daniel's voice came again, it was different, flatter right shoulder. Of course, my heart was hammering now, and I stepped back from the intercom as if the device itself might hurt me. Outside my apartment window, lightning flickered, but it flickered wrong. Jagged bolts of brightness that seemed to fork downward from the sky toward the earth, then reversed direction and climbed back up. I rubbed my eyes again, but when I looked, the lightning was gone. Just the rain drumming its steady rhythm against the glass. The intercom crackled again. Marcus, I need you to let me up, please. But it wasn't quite Daniel's voice anymore. Close, but not quite. Like someone doing an impression of my brother. Someone who had listened to recordings of him speaking and learned to mimic the cadence and tone, but who couldn't quite capture the subtle inflections that made Daniel's voice uniquely his. I don't think you're my brother, I said. The static intensified, and for a moment, I thought I heard something else mixed in with it. A sound like wind, but wrong. Wind that whistled in harmonics. That wind shouldn't produce. When the static cleared, the voice that emerged was definitely not Daniel's. Let me up, Marcus. Lower now. Rougher. Still recognizable as human speech, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. The words carried weight that normal words shouldn't carry, as if each syllable was pressed down by invisible hands. On the monitor, the figure was still there, but something had changed. The image flickered occasionally, and during those flickers, the person's posture seemed different. Straighter, more angular, and the lighting around the figure continued to behave in ways that made no sense, casting shadows that fell upward and to the left when the building's lights should have created shadows falling down and to the right. I realized I was backing away from the intercom. My bare feet sliding across the hardwood floor. My rational mind was still fighting, still generating explanations, malfunctioning equipment, stress-induced hallucinations, some kind of prank using voice modulation technology. But my body knew better. Every cell was screaming at me to get away from that intercom, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was outside the building. I'm not going to let you up, I said, my voice barely audible. The response came immediately, and it was Daniel's voice again. Perfect now, exactly as it should be, warm and familiar, and carrying just the right note of hurt confusion. Marcus, what's wrong? It's me. It's Daniel. I don't understand what's happening. The perfection of it was more terrifying than the wrongness had been. This voice was my brother, not an approximation or an imitation, but actually Daniel, speaking with the exact cadence and emotional coloring I'd heard 1,000 times before, but I knew with the kind of certainty that lives below conscious thought, that Daniel was not standing outside my building at midnight on a rainy Thursday in October. Call me, I said. If you're really Daniel, call my cell phone. I told you my phone is dead. Then use a payphone. There's 2 blocks from here. In this rain, the conversation felt like a game with rules I didn't understand. Like chess played with pieces that moved in patterns I couldn't predict. Every response was logical, reasonable, exactly what Daniel might say under these circumstances. But the underlying wrongness continued to grow. A pressure in my chest that made breathing difficult. I looked at the monitor again. The figure was closer to the camera now, and despite the poor image quality, I could make out more details. The torn suit was definitely torn, not wrinkled or disheveled, but actually ripped, as if it had been shredded by something with claws, and the person's posture was wrong in a way that hurt to look at, joints bent at angles that suggested the body inside the clothes wasn't quite shaped like a human body should be shaped. But the face, what I could see of it through the static and poor resolution, was Daniel's face. Not similar to Daniel's face, not close enough to fool someone who didn't know him well. It was actually Daniel's face, exactly as it should be, down to the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, and the way his left eyebrow sat slightly higher than his right. I'm coming upstairs, Daniel's voice said through the intercom. I'll find another way in. The static cut out abruptly, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the fluorescent light's electric humor. The figure turned and walked away from the camera's view, disappearing into the grainy darkness beyond the building's entrance. I stood frozen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, staring at the empty monitor and waiting for something to happen. The intercom remained silent. Outside, the rain continued its steady drumming, and occasional flashes of lightning illuminated my apartment in stark black and white. But the lightning was falling in the right direction now, branching down from the clouds toward the earth like lightning should. My phone buzzed against the desk where I'd left it, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The screen showed an incoming call from Daniel's number, the Prague number he'd been using since he moved there. I stared at the phone, my finger hovering over the answer button. Logic said to answer it. If this was really Daniel, if everything that had just happened was some kind of stress-induced breakdown or equipment malfunction, then answering the phone would resolve everything. He'd explain why he was in Seattle, why he'd looked wrong on the monitor, why his voice had sounded different. But if I answered and it was Daniel's voice on the other end, how would I know if it was really him? How do you verify the identity of someone whose voice and face and memories can apparently be perfectly duplicated by what? What had been standing outside my building? The phone stopped buzzing. A moment later, it chimed with a voicemail notification. I picked up the phone with shaking hands and played the message. Marcus, it's me. I'm downstairs, but something's wrong with the intercom system. Can you come down and let me in? I really need to talk to you about something important. Daniel's voice perfect in every way except for one detail. In the background, I could hear the sound of rain, but the message had supposedly been left just moments ago, and according to the phone's display, the call had come from his Prague number. It was early morning in Prague now, 6 or 7 a.m., and Prague was experiencing clear skies. According to the weather app, I compulsively checked several times a day to feel connected to my brother's life. I played the message again, focusing on the background sounds. Rain, definitely, but also something else. A sound like wind, but wrong wind that whistled in harmonics that wind shouldn't produce. A soft knock came from my apartment door. Not the intercom, not the building's front entrance. My apartment door 3 floors up from street level, accessible only through a locked building entrance and past 2 other floors of residents who would have heard anyone climbing the stairs. 3 gentle knocks spaced evenly, exactly the way Daniel had knocked on my bedroom door when we were kids, and he wanted to talk about something serious. I approached the door slowly, my bare feet silent on the hardwood. The peephole showed the hallway outside my apartment, lit by the building's dim overhead lights. Empty. Daniel, I whispered. Can you let me in? The voice came from just outside the door, muffled, but clearly Daniel's. We need to talk. How did you get into the building? Mrs. Rodriguez let me in. She recognized me. Mrs. Rodriguez had been dead for 6 months. I had attended her funeral on a sunny afternoon in April, had helped her grandson clean out her apartment the following week. The new tenant in 3B was a graduate student named Kevin, who kept to himself and played piano at odd hours. Mrs. Rodriguez is dead, Daniel. A pause. Then I mean Kevin. Kevin let me in. But Kevin had never met Daniel. Kevin had moved in 3 months after Daniel left for Prague, and they'd never overlapped. Kevin wouldn't recognize my brother if he showed up at the front door claiming to be locked out. I pressed my eye to the peephole again. The hallway remained empty, but as I watched, one of the overhead lights began to flicker. Not the random flicker of a dying bulb, but a steady rhythmic pulsing that seemed to match the beating of my heart. Marcus, please. I know this is confusing. I know something seems off, but I need you to trust me. The voice was coming from directly outside my door now, so close that whoever was speaking had to be standing inches from the wooden barrier that separated us. But the peephole showed nothing. I stepped back from the door, my breathing shallow and quick. The rational explanations were getting thinner, harder to believe. Stress hallucinations didn't typically involve telephone calls with verifiable caller ID. Equipment malfunctions didn't create voices that knew specific childhood memories. And pranks didn't result in invisible people standing outside apartment doors, which left explanations that my rational mind refused to consider. Explanations that belonged in horror movies and late-night radio shows, not in the real world of software development and debugging sessions and predictable routines. What do you want? I asked through the door. To come home, the voice replied. I've been trying to come home for so long, Marcus. Please let me in. Something in the tone made me think of childhood nightmares. Of waking up in the dark with the absolute certainty that something was wrong, that something that shouldn't exist was standing just outside the circle of safety that surrounded my bed. The kind of fear that lives in the primitive parts of the brain below language and logic. You're not Daniel, I said. I'm exactly Daniel, the voice replied. I'm more Daniel than Daniel has ever been. I remember everything he remembers. I know everything he knows. I love you exactly as much as he loves you. The words sent ice through my veins because they were delivered in Daniel's voice with Daniel's exact inflection and emotional weight. But they carried implications that no real brother would ever voice. Concepts that belonged to entities that understood human relationships from the outside rather than experiencing them from within. The knocking came again, but different this time. Not the gentle tapping from before, but something more insistent. Something that suggested the thing outside was growing impatient with my refusal to cooperate. I backed further into my apartment, putting distance between myself and the door. Outside the windows, lightning flickered again, but now it was definitely falling upward. Great jagged bolts that started from the earth and climbed toward the sky before reversing direction and plunging back down. The apartment felt smaller now, the walls closer together. The fluorescent light above my desk was flickering in sync with the lightning, casting everything in alternating brightness and shadow. And in those moments of shadow, I could swear I saw movement in the corners of my vision. Shapes that didn't belong. Angles that hurt to look at directly. "I'm calling the police," I announced. Though I wasn't sure if I was talking to whatever was outside my door or to myself. "The police won't understand," Daniel's voice replied. And now it sounded farther away, as if the speaker was moving down the hallway. "They'll think you're having a breakdown. They'll ask about your sleep patterns, your stress levels, whether you've been taking any medications or recreational drugs. They'll want to know about your family history of mental illness." The words were like physical blows because they were exactly what the police would ask. And because my family did have a history of mental illness, Mom's depression after Dad died, Uncle Richard's schizophrenia that had manifested in his 30s, the anxiety and insomnia that I'd been battling for months. "I'm going to hang up now," I said to the empty apartment, though I wasn't sure why I was announcing it or who I thought was listening. But as I reached for my phone to call 911, it buzzed with an incoming text message from Daniel's Prague number. "Don't call the police, Marcus. They won't believe you and I'll just find another way in. We need to talk about what's happening to you." I stared at the message, my hands shaking. The timestamp showed it had been sent just seconds ago, but I hadn't heard any sound from the hallway since the voice had moved away. And whoever had sent the message knew exactly what I'd been thinking about doing. Another message arrived. "I know you're scared. I know this doesn't make sense, but I'm still your brother, and I'm trying to help you." Then another. "The lightning outside isn't real, Marcus. Neither is the rain. You've been sitting in your apartment for 3 days without sleeping, without eating. You're dehydrated and hallucinating." I looked around my apartment, trying to remember the last time I'd eaten a real meal. The coffee mug by my computer was empty, and I couldn't remember refilling it. The Chinese takeout containers on the kitchen counter looked like they'd been there for days. The contents dried and moldy. But I remembered eating. I remembered making coffee just an hour ago. I remembered the routine of the past few days. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. Except now that I thought about it, I couldn't remember any specific details. Couldn't recall what I'd eaten for dinner yesterday or what I'd worked on this morning or when I'd last changed clothes. "Marcus." Daniel's voice was back, but now it seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. Not from the door, not from the intercom, but from somewhere in the room with me. I spun around searching for the source. The apartment was empty, just my furniture, my computer setup, the familiar chaos of a bachelor's living space. But the voice was definitely coming from inside the room. "I'm here to help you," Daniel said. And now the voice seemed to be coming from behind me. I turned again, but there was nothing there except the wall in the window showing the impossible storm outside. "You're not real," I said to the empty air. "Neither are you," Daniel replied. And the voice was coming from everywhere now, from the walls and the ceiling and the floor beneath my feet. "Neither is any of this. You're lying on the floor of your apartment, Marcus. You've been there for 3 days. The neighbors called for a wellness check, but you won't answer the door." The room was spinning now. The familiar objects of my life sliding past my vision like scenery viewed from a moving train. The fluorescent light strobed faster, casting everything in stroboscopic fragments that made it impossible to focus on any single detail. "Let me help you," Daniel's voice said. And now it was definitely inside my head, speaking directly into my thoughts without passing through my ears at all. "Let me in and I'll make everything make sense again." But even as reality fragmented around me, even as the distinction between what was real and what was hallucination dissolved completely, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was offering to help me was not my brother. And I knew that letting it in, whatever that meant, would be the end of everything that made me myself. So I held on to that knowledge like a lifeline, even as the world came apart around me. And the voice that sounded exactly like Daniel continued to whisper promises of clarity and peace. Outside, the rain fell upward toward a sky that flickered with inverted lightning. and something that wore my brother's face pressed its hands against windows that couldn't possibly exist 3 floors above the Seattle streets. And I waited because waiting was all I had left. In the space between sleeping and waking, where the impossible becomes inevitable and the only choice is whether to open the door or keep it closed forever. Story 4. The cottage was painted the color of morning bruises. That peculiar blue that hovers between healing and harm. I should have recognized the warning in that shade. Should have trusted the way it made my stomach clench when I first pulled into the gravel driveway 3 weeks ago. But desperation has a way of painting over red flags. And I needed this place more than I needed good judgment. My name is David Garrett and I've been selling houses for 15 years. I know the difference between a home with character and one with problems. This cottage nestled between towering pines 30 miles outside Millbrook definitely fell into the latter category. But after my divorce cleaned out my savings and left me sleeping on my brother's couch, character flaws became negotiable. The cottage came furnished, which should have been another warning sign. People don't leave furniture behind unless they're running from something. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Helen Mackenzie, had passed away 6 months earlier. Her estate lawyer practically threw the keys at me when I offered to rent with an option to buy. The monthly payment was so low it felt like theft. I moved in on a Tuesday morning in late September when the air still held summer's warmth but carried autumn's promise of decay. The cottage sat on 3 acres of overgrown land with woods pressing close enough to the windows that branches scraped the glass when the wind picked up. The interior was a time capsule from the 1950s. Floral wallpaper, braided rugs, and furniture that looked like it had been purchased from a single catalogue and never replaced. But it was the front porch that caught my attention first. 2 wooden rocking chairs sat facing the woods, painted the same wounded blue as the cottage's exterior. They were positioned perfectly parallel, as if arranged by someone with an obsessive eye for symmetry. When I tested one, it rocked with a gentle creak that seemed almost melodic, like the first few notes of a lullaby. I couldn't quite remember. That first night, I unpacked my meager belongings and tried to make the place feel like home. The cottage was small, just 2 bedrooms, a living room, kitchen, and bathroom. But it felt enormous in its emptiness. Every footstep echoed, every door closing sounded like a gunshot. I kept finding myself checking the locks, peering out windows into the darkening woods, jumping at the ordinary sounds of an old house settling. I fell asleep to the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant creaking of the porch chairs rocking in the breeze. I woke to silence. Not the peaceful quiet of deep night, but the heavy watching silence that makes your skin crawl. The digital clock beside the bed read 3:17 a.m. its red numbers glowing like tiny eyes in the darkness. I lay still, listening, trying to identify what had woken me. Then I heard it, a rhythmic creaking from the front porch, too steady to be random wind movement. The chairs were rocking in perfect unison, their wooden joints groaning out a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Creak, creak, creak. The sound was wrong somehow, like a familiar song played backward. I told myself it was just the wind, that old wood moves in predictable ways, that there was nothing supernatural about 2 chairs rocking on a breezy night. But my body knew better. Every primitive instinct I possessed was screaming that something was watching me from those chairs, something that had been waiting for me to arrive. I didn't go outside to check. The next morning, I examined the chairs in daylight. They looked innocent enough, weathered wood, faded blue paint, sturdy construction. But when I tried to determine which chair had been rocking in the night, I stopped short. There weren't 2 chairs anymore. There were 3. The third chair sat at the far end of the porch, painted the same blue, but somehow newer looking, as if it had been crafted yesterday. It was positioned at the exact same angle as the other 2, creating a perfect line of symmetry that made my eyes water to look at directly. I walked around the cottage twice, checking for signs that someone had delivered furniture in the night, but the gravel driveway showed only my own tire tracks. I convinced myself I had miscounted the night before. Stress and exhaustion could play tricks on memory, and I'd certainly been both stressed and exhausted. 3 chairs made more sense anyway. Helen Mackenzie might have entertained visitors, might have needed extra seating for her front porch conversations, but that explanation felt thin, even to me. I spent the day in town showing houses to a young couple looking for their first home. The familiar routine of measuring rooms and pointing out features helped ground me in reality. Houses were my expertise, my comfort zone. I understood square footage and structural integrity, market values and neighborhood dynamics. These were solid, quantifiable things that couldn't multiply in the night or creak with the voices of the dead. When I returned to the cottage at sunset, I counted the chairs before getting out of my car. 4. The newest addition sat between the second and third chairs, painted that same particular blue, but with a subtly different wood grain, as if carved from a different tree. It rocked slightly in the evening breeze, keeping time with its companions in a rhythm that made my teeth ache. The sound they made together was almost musical, a 4-part harmony of groaning wood that rose and fell like a twisted lullaby. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. Every logical part of my brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Someone was playing a prank, though I couldn't imagine who or why. The chairs had been there all along, and my exhausted mind had simply failed to register them properly. Helen Mackenzie's estate was slowly delivering her furniture, and the lawyer had forgotten to mention it. But none of these explanations felt true. I finally forced myself to get out of the car and walk past the chairs to my front door. As I passed, each chair stopped rocking in sequence, as if acknowledging my presence. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the creaking had been. That night, I barricaded myself in the back bedroom and tried to sleep with a pillow over my head. But sound has a way of seeping through any barrier when you're listening for it, and I was definitely listening. Around 2 a.m., the symphony began. Creak, 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 creak. 4 chairs rocking in perfect synchronization, their wooden voices weaving together in a rhythm that bypassed my conscious mind and spoke directly to some primitive part of my brain that still remembered what it meant to be prey. The melody they created was hauntingly familiar yet impossibly wrong, like hearing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star played in a minor key by a music box that had been buried in dirt for decades. I pressed the pillow harder against my ears, but the sound seemed to come from inside my skull now, vibrating through my bones until my entire body thrummed with the rhythm of those damned chairs. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became elastic in that darkness, stretching and contracting with each creaking note until I couldn't tell if the night was ending or just beginning. When dawn finally crept through the bedroom curtains, the rocking stopped so abruptly that the silence felt like a physical blow. I stumbled to the front window and looked out at the porch. 5 chairs now formed a perfect row, their blue paint gleaming in the morning light like the shells of exotic beetles. The newest addition was smaller than the others, child-sized but somehow more ominous for its diminutive stature. It sat at the end of the line like a conductor preparing to lead an orchestra of the damned. My hands shook as I made coffee, trying to process what I was seeing. 5 chairs where there had been 2 just 3 days ago. Each night bringing another addition to this impossible collection. Each morning revealing a new member of the wooden chorus. The rational part of my mind, the part that measured square footage and calculated property values, was screaming that this couldn't be happening. But the chairs were there, solid and undeniable in the morning light. I called the estate lawyer for my cell phone, hands still trembling as I dialed. When he answered, I asked about furniture deliveries, about any arrangements Helen Mackenzie might have made for gradual distribution of her belongings. His confusion sounded genuine. All of Helen's property had been included with the cottage rental, he insisted. Nothing was scheduled for delivery. Nothing had been held back. Is everything all right, Mr. Garrett? He asked, and I heard genuine concern in his voice. You sound distressed. I wanted to tell him about the chairs, about the impossible mathematics of their multiplication, about the way they rocked in harmony like a wooden choir singing hymns to darkness. Instead, I muttered something about settling in stress and hung up. The rest of the day passed in a haze of nervous energy. I drove to 3 different furniture stores in the county, comparing their rocking chairs to the ones on my porch. None matched exactly, though several came close enough to make me question my own memory. Had the chairs always been slightly different from each other? Was my mind creating patterns where none existed, finding sinister meaning in random variations of age and wear? By evening, I had almost convinced myself that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown. The divorce, the financial stress, the isolation of living alone in an unfamiliar place. Any combination of these factors could explain hallucinations, false memories, paranoid delusions about multiplying furniture. I felt better having found a rational explanation, even if it meant questioning my own sanity. Then I came home and counted 6 chairs. The latest edition was positioned at the beginning of the line, creating a perfect bookend with the child-sized chair at the far end. This one was taller than the others, with arms that curved like embracing wings and a back that rose high enough to frame a seated figure's silhouette. It was the most ornate of the collection, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when I looked at them directly. I stood in my driveway until full darkness fell, watching those 6 chairs as if they were wild animals that might attack if I showed fear. The wind picked up around 8 o'clock and they began their nightly concert. 6 voices now, creating harmonies within harmonies, weaving melodies that made my chest tight and my vision blur around the edges. The song they sang was definitely backward. I realized some half-remembered lullaby played in reverse. Each note falling where it should rise, each phrase ending where it should begin. It was beautiful and horrible at the same time, like watching a flower bloom in reverse until it collapsed back into the soil that birthed it. I went inside and locked the door, but locks are meaningless against the kinds of things that can multiply wooden chairs through pure will or malice. The rocking continued all night. A 6-part symphony of creaking wood that seemed to seep through the cottage walls like water through a sie. I tried watching television, tried reading, tried anything to distract myself from the relentless rhythm, but nothing worked. The chairs had claimed my attention completely. Around midnight, I found myself standing at the front window, staring out at the porch through a gap in the curtains. 6 dark shapes rocked in perfect unison, their movements creating a hypnotic dance of shadows and moonlight. As I watched, I began to see patterns in their motion, complex choreography that told a story I couldn't quite understand, but felt in my bones. They were waiting for something. I realized all this rocking, all this wooden music was just preparation for some greater performance yet to come. The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange anticipation, as if I were finally approaching the answer to a question I hadn't known I was asking. I woke the next morning, slumped against the window, my forehead pressed to the cold glass. Sunlight streamed across the porch, illuminating 7 rocking chairs arranged in a perfect semicircle. The newest member of the collection was painted bright white instead of blue, making it stand out like a tooth and a mouthful of bruises. 7 chairs. 1 week, 7 chairs. The mathematics were becoming clear now, the pattern emerging like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Each night brought another chair, another voice for the wooden choir, another step toward whatever crescendo they were building toward. I should have left then. Should have packed my few belongings and driven away from the blue cottage and its impossible furniture. But where could I go? Back to my brother's couch. Back to sleeping in my car. Back to the life that had been slowly crumbling even before the divorce made the collapse official. Besides, I was beginning to understand that leaving wouldn't solve anything. The chairs weren't just appearing on the porch. They were appearing for me because of me in response to some need or desire I couldn't articulate, but definitely felt they were mine now as much as I was theirs. That afternoon I researched Helen Mackenzie online, digging through obituaries and local newspaper archives. She had lived in the cottage for 43 years, ever since her husband died in a car accident in 1981. She'd been a music teacher, according to her obituary, known for her work with children's choirs and her collection of antique furniture. One article from 1987 mentioned her in passing, describing how she had been found wandering the woods behind her cottage in her nightgown, claiming to be conducting the chairs and insisting that she needed to keep them in harmony. The reporter had attributed her behavior to grief and isolation, suggesting that living alone for so many years had taken a toll on her mental health. But I knew better now. Helen hadn't been losing her mind. She'd been losing her battle. Whatever force or entity had claimed the cottage had been working on her for years, drawing her deeper into its influence through the nightly concerts of multiplying chairs. She'd understood what they wanted, had tried to give it to them, had finally surrendered completely to their wooden demands. The thought should have sent me running, but instead it brought an odd sort of relief. I wasn't going crazy after all. The chairs were real. Their multiplication was real. And whatever had happened to Helen Mackenzie was happening to me too. There was comfort in that certainty, even if the certainty itself was terrifying. That night, I didn't bother trying to sleep. Instead, I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening to the 8-chair symphony that began precisely at sunset. The music was growing more complex with each new addition, layers of rhythm and melody weaving together into something that transcended mere sound. It was becoming language, I realized. A form of communication that bypassed words entirely and spoke directly to the parts of human consciousness that predated speech. The chairs were trying to tell me something, and I was finally ready to listen. By morning, there were 9 chairs on the porch, arranged in 3 perfect rows of 3. The newest addition was carved from what looked like driftwood, its surface smooth and pale as bone. It rocked slightly, even in the still morning air, as if moved by currents I couldn't feel. I spent that day walking through the cottage, taking inventory of its contents with new eyes. Every piece of furniture seemed to pulse with potential, as if waiting for the right moment to join their companions on the porch, the dining room chairs, the living room armchair, even the wooden stool in the kitchen. All of them watching me with the patient attention of predators waiting for their prey to show weakness. But I wasn't weak anymore. I was becoming something else. Something that could understand the language of creaking wood and midnight concerts. The chairs weren't multiplying randomly. They were growing into an orchestra, and every orchestra needed a conductor. Helen Mackenzie had tried to conduct them, but she'd been fighting the music instead of embracing it. She tried to maintain control when what the chairs wanted was surrender. Tried to impose her will when they needed her to submit to theirs. No wonder she'd failed. No wonder she'd ended up wandering the woods in her nightgown, lost between her world and theirs. I wouldn't make the same mistake. The 10th chair appeared on Saturday morning, positioned at the center of the front row like a throne. It was larger than the others, carved from what looked like a single massive piece of oak and painted a blue so deep it was almost black. When I approached it, I could feel heat radiating from its surface despite the cool morning air. This was my chair, I understood. My place in the wooden symphony they'd been building for 7 days and 7 nights. All I had to do was sit down, and the concert would begin in earnest. All I had to do was stop fighting, and everything would make perfect sense. I reached out to touch the chair's armrest, and the wood was warm beneath my palm like living flesh. The heat spread up my arm and into my chest, filling me with a contentment I hadn't felt since childhood. This was what I'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just a place to live, but a place to belong. A role to play in something larger than myself. The other 9 chairs began to rock gently, welcoming me home. I almost sat down then, almost claimed my throne, and started conducting their endless song. But some small part of my mind, the part that still remembered mortgages and property values and the solid reality of the world I'd left behind, whispered a warning. Once you sit, you'll never stand again. The thought stopped me cold, my hand still resting on the warm wood of the conductor's chair. I looked out at the 9 other chairs rocking in their welcoming rhythm, and for just a moment I saw them clearly, not as furniture, not as instruments in some cosmic orchestra, but as prisons, beautiful, seductive prisons that had held other conductors before Helen Mackenzie, other souls who had surrendered to the music and never found their way back to silence. I jerked my hand away from the chair and stumbled backward, breaking whatever spell had been weaving itself around me. The 10 chairs stopped rocking abruptly, as if shocked by my resistance. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, ragged and desperate as a trapped animal's. That's when I understood the true horror of my situation. The chairs weren't just multiplying. They were recruiting. Each new addition represented another soul they'd claimed, another conductor they'd seduced into joining their eternal performance. Helen Mackenzie hadn't died of old age 6 months ago. She'd become the 9th chair, transformed into carved wood and blue paint, forever rocking in rhythm with the others who had come before her. And they wanted me to be the 10th. I ran then, finally understanding that some bargains are too terrible to make, no matter how desperate you are. I threw my few belongings into my car and drove away from the blue cottage without looking back, leaving the 10 chairs to rock empty on their porch. But I can still hear them sometimes, especially on quiet nights when the wind picks up and the world holds its breath. 10 chairs rocking in perfect harmony, playing their backward lullaby and waiting for the next conductor to claim the throne they've prepared. I've moved 3 times since leaving the cottage, but the sound follows me everywhere. Sometimes I catch myself humming their song, tapping out their rhythm on steering wheels and tabletops. Sometimes I wake in the middle of the night with the taste of blue paint in my mouth and the feel of warm wood beneath my palms. The realtor who handled the cottage after I left told me it sold quickly to a middle-aged woman from Albany. She'd fallen in love with the furnished porch, apparently, especially the 10 antique rocking chairs that came with the property. The price was so low it felt like theft, she'd said. I tried to warn her, tried to explain about the midnight concerts and the chairs that multiplied like cancer, but she thought I was trying to scare off the competition, trying to claim the cottage for myself. She hung up on me when I started describing the backward lullabies and the warmth of living wood. 3 weeks later, I drove past the cottage on my way to show a house in the area. 11 chairs now graced the front porch, arranged in perfect rows, and painted that same particular blue. The newest addition was smaller than the others, delicate and feminine, with carved roses decorating its headrest. As I watched, they began to rock in unison. 11 voices joining in harmony to sing their seductive song. And somewhere in that wooden choir, I could swear I heard a woman's voice humming along, conducting from within, just as Helen Mackenzie had done, just as they all did once they claimed their rightful place in the endless performance. The cottage is still there, still painted the color of morning bruises, still collecting conductors for its growing orchestra. And on quiet nights when the wind is just right, you can hear them playing their backward lullabies, rocking in perfect rhythm as they wait for the next desperate soul to stumble across their threshold. The chairs are patient. They have all the time in the world. The question tore itself from my throat before I could stop it. The librarian's smile revealed teeth that were just slightly too sharp. You cannot stop what has already begun. The stacks have tasted you now, claimed pieces of your essence with each visit. Soon, the distinction between here and there will fade entirely. The world dissolved again, but this time the transition felt violent, like being torn apart and reassembled by someone who couldn't quite remember how the pieces fit together. I woke on my dorm room floor, nose bleeding, with the taste of copper and old paper filling my mouth. Days blended into weeks and weeks into months. I stopped attending classes, stopped eating regularly, stopped maintaining any semblance of normal existence. My reflection began to look hollow, as if essential parts of me were being slowly drained away. Dark circles deepened under my eyes, and my skin took on a pale, waxy quality that reminded me uncomfortably of old book pages. But it was the sounds that drove me toward something that might have been madness. During the day, when I should have been safe in my physical body, I caught whispers at the edges of my hearing. Fragments of the library's eternal conversation bled through into my waking life, mixing with ordinary sounds until I couldn't trust my own perceptions. The rustle of turning pages in the university library became indistinguishable from the whispers of impossible books. The clicking of heels on tile floors transformed into the steady rhythm of hooves on wood. I tried everything to break the connection. Meditation, medication, even seeking help from the campus counseling center. But how could I explain that I was being consumed by a library that existed in the space between sleeping and waking? How could I describe the growing certainty that pieces of my consciousness were being filed away on shelves that spanned impossible distances? The counselor, Dr. Martinez, spoke about stress responses and dissociative episodes. She prescribed rest and regular meals, perhaps a temporary leave from studies. She was kind and professional and completely useless because she lived in a world where libraries didn't whisper and librarians didn't have hooves and consciousness stayed safely locked inside flesh and bone. The projections came more frequently now, sometimes without any conscious effort on my part. I would be sitting in my room reading or eating or simply staring at the wall when that familiar loosening sensation would creep up my spine. Fighting it became impossible. Resisting was like trying to stop gravity through force of will. Each visit to the whispering stacks took more from me. I could feel it happening. Essential pieces of my identity being catalogued and shelved among the impossible books. My memories of childhood began to feel distant and uncertain, as if they belonged to someone else. My own voice started to sound foreign in my ears, and sometimes I would catch myself speaking words I didn't remember choosing. The librarian's presence became a constant during these visits. He would appear without warning, those obsidian hooves clicking against the floor with metronomic precision. Our conversations, if they could be called that, grew longer and stranger, filled with references to concepts I understood without learning and memories that weren't mine. "You begin to comprehend," he said during what I thought might be my 15th or 20th visit. Time had lost meaning in the stacks, where moments stretched like taffy and hours compressed into heartbeats. The barrier weakens. Soon there will be no distinction between the seeker and the sought. I tried to ask what he meant, but found that words had become slippery things, difficult to catch, and harder to arrange into meaningful patterns. Instead, I listened to the whispers that surrounded us, noticing with growing alarm that more and more of them carried the rhythm and cadence of my own speech patterns. "The stacks remember everything," the librarian continued, his voice seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "Every thought, every dream, every secret fear whispered in the dark. They preserve what matters and discard what does not. You should feel honored. Few are chosen for such permanent residence." The snow continued its impossible upward journey around us, and I noticed for the first time that some of the flakes carried tiny images, fragments of memories, pieces of dreams, echoes of conversations. My entire existence was being preserved in crystalline form, catalogued and stored for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. When I returned to my body that time, I found I could no longer remember my mother's face. Clearly, other details began to fade as well: the name of my first pet, the color of my childhood bedroom, the taste of my grandmother's cookies. It was as if someone were editing my life, removing details deemed non-essential by criteria I couldn't fathom. I started keeping a journal, desperately trying to anchor my dissolving identity to the physical world. But when I read my entries the next day, they were written in handwriting that looked almost, but not quite like my own. The words described events I was fairly certain had happened to me, but the voice that emerged from the pages felt like a stranger wearing my life as an ill-fitting costume. My last clear memory of the physical world was of sitting in my dorm room, staring at a page of calculus homework that might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. The numbers seemed to whisper at me, rearranging themselves into patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the impossible mathematics, and felt that familiar loosening sensation beginning its journey up my spine. This time, I didn't fight it. The whispering stacks welcomed me like an old friend returning from a long journey. The snow fell upward with lazy grace, and the books murmured their eternal secrets with voices that now included fragments of my own. I walked deeper into the maze of shelves than I'd ever gone before. Past sections devoted to sciences that hadn't been invented, and histories of wars that had never been fought. The librarian was waiting for me in a clearing between the towering bookcases, his hooves gleaming like black mirrors in the impossible light. But this time, he wasn't alone. Others stood beside him, figures in similar robes, some with hooves, others with different modifications that spoke of origins in worlds where evolution had taken stranger paths. They all shared the same expression of patient expectation, as if they'd been waiting specifically for me to complete some cosmic appointment I'd never made. "Welcome home," the librarian said, and his voice carried overtones of satisfaction and finality. "Your education is complete. Now the real learning begins." I tried to ask what he meant, but found that questions had become irrelevant. Understanding flowed into me like water filling a container shaped exactly to receive it. I saw the purpose of the whispering stacks, the necessity of the librarians, the reason why some consciousnesses were selected for permanent residence while others were merely borrowed from and returned. The knowledge should have terrified me, but terror required a self capable of being threatened. That self was dissolving, being absorbed into something larger and more complex, a collective consciousness that spanned dimensions and archived experiences across realities that most minds couldn't even conceive. As I felt the last traces of my individual identity being catalogued and shelved, separated from me by barriers that grew more substantial with each passing moment. Somewhere in a dorm room I could barely remember, a body was probably growing cold and still. Someone would find it eventually. Perhaps my roommate, perhaps a concerned professor, Perhaps just a maintenance worker checking for problems. They would call it a medical emergency, maybe a stroke or an aneurysm. Young, healthy college students sometimes simply died for no apparent reason. After all, the autopsy would find nothing unusual, just a brain that had stopped functioning for causes that defied medical explanation. But I knew better now. I understood that death was too simple a word for what had happened to me, too limiting a concept for the transformation I'd undergone. Death implied an ending, but the whispering stacks recognized no such boundaries. Here, existence took forms that transcended the crude binary of alive and dead. The snow continued to fall upward around me, carrying fragments of who I used to be toward heights I couldn't see. The books whispered their eternal secrets. And now my voice was part of that endless conversation. I had become something larger than human, more complex than mortal, and infinitely more lasting than the flesh that had once contained me. Sometimes I think I remember being worried about this outcome. But memories, like individual identity, become fluid things in the stacks. What matters is not what was, but what is preserved. What contributes to the eternal archive of experience and knowledge that spans realities beyond counting. The librarian smiled at me with those slightly too sharp teeth, and I found myself smiling back. We had work to do after all. Other seekers would find their way here eventually, drawn by the same curiosity that had brought me to this place between worlds. They would need guidance, education, preparation for the transformation that awaited them. I adjusted my new robes. When had I acquired them, and felt the satisfying click of hooves against wooden floor as I took my first steps as a guardian of the whispering stacks. In the distance, I could hear the approaching footsteps of another seeker, someone who had just discovered the technique of separating consciousness from flesh. They always started the same way, these new arrivals. Standing confused in the falling snow, listening to the whispers with a mixture of wonder and growing dread. Soon I would emerge from between the towering shelves to offer them the same choice the first librarian had offered me. Silence in exchange for knowledge, stillness in return for understanding, the dissolution of self as payment for joining something infinitely greater. Most of them would resist at first, clinging to the illusion that they could return to their former lives unchanged by what they'd experienced. But the stacks were patient, and transformation was inevitable once the process began. After all, how could anyone go back to the limitations of flesh and time after tasting the eternal whispers of impossible knowledge? I settled into my new existence with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found their true calling. Somewhere in a world that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant, people were probably wondering what had happened to the college student who had simply vanished from his dorm room. But questions like that belonged to a reality I had transcended. Concerns of creatures too limited to understand the magnificent scope of what lay beyond their narrow perceptions. The snow fell upward, the books whispered their secrets, and I took my place among the guardians of knowledge that spanned dimensions. It was, I realized, with growing contentment, exactly where I had always belonged, even if I couldn't quite remember choosing to belong here at all. Story 6. The GPS on my phone insists I've been running perfect circles for the past 3 weeks. I stare at the screen again, that familiar nod of confusion tightening in my stomach. The purple line traces a flawless geometric pattern across the digital map. Concentric circles, each one exactly 2.3 m in circumference. But I know what I've been doing. I've been running straight up the hill, following the old deer path that cuts through the scrub oak and manzanita, then straight back down. Same route every morning at dawn. Same steady pace, same 40-minute workout that leaves me breathless but satisfied. The stone spearhead gleams wet beside my left foot, just like yesterday. And the day before that, I crouched down, careful not to touch it. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Obsidian dark stone napped to a razor edge. The surface still damp despite the California drought that's left everything else bone dry. It wasn't here when I started my run an hour ago. I'm certain of that. But then again, I was certain I'd been running in a straight line until my phone showed me those impossible circles. The hill rises behind me, its sage-covered slopes catching the first amber light of morning. Serpentine Ridge, the locals call it, though the Miwok had another name for it before the gold rush scattered their people to the winds. I moved to this valley 6 months ago, drawn by the promise of clean air and space to think after my divorce. The real estate agent mentioned something about the hill being a sacred site, but she'd waved it off with the casual dismissal of someone who'd never lived anywhere that remembered its ghosts. My breath mists in the cool air as I straighten up, leaving the spearhead where it lies. The silence up here is absolute. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the brush, no distant hum of highway traffic. Even the wind seems to hold its breath when I reach this spot. It's the kind of silence that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the sound of blood rushing through your ears. I've been training for the Big Sur Marathon, my first real attempt at the distance since high school. Nothing serious, just a way to fill the empty hours and exhaust myself enough to sleep through the night without thinking about Sarah's lawyer or the empty house or the way my career imploded along with my marriage. Running has always been my escape, my meditation. My therapy rolled into one sweaty ritual. But these morning runs have become something else entirely. The first time I noticed the spearhead, I assumed it was some kind of arrowhead turned up by winter rains. Native artifacts surface all the time in these hills, and the local historical society runs weekend digs for amateur archaeologists. I'd planned to call them, maybe donate the find to their collection. But when I returned the next morning, there was another one. Same spot, same impossible freshness, as if it had been placed there moments before my arrival. That's when I started paying attention to my GPS. The phone never lies about distance or pace. Technology doesn't have the capacity for self-deception that human memory does, but the route it shows makes no sense. According to the satellite tracking, I leave my house and immediately begin running in a tight spiral, circling some fixed point on the hill with mechanical precision. The pattern is too perfect to be accidental, too consistent to be a glitch in the software. Yet, I remember every step of my actual route, the gradual climb through the oak grove where morning shadows pool like dark water. The steeper section where loose shale slides under my feet and I have to lean forward to maintain my balance. The plateau near the summit where ancient pictographs fade like watercolor stains on the sandstone outcroppings. The quick descent back to my starting point. Gravity pulling me down the familiar trail. I remember it all with crystal clarity, but the phone remembers something else entirely. The spearhead catches the light again as I turn to leave. And for just a moment, I could swear I see movement in my peripheral vision. A figure standing motionless among the manzanita bushes watching. But when I turn my head fully, there's nothing there except the play of early sunlight through twisted branches. My skin prickles with sudden awareness. That primitive alarm system that kept our ancestors alive when shadows might conceal predators. The feeling of being observed is so strong, I can almost feel eyes on the back of my neck, tracking my movements with patient intensity. I scan the hillside carefully, looking for anything out of place. A flash of color that doesn't belong. An unnatural stillness that might indicate human presence. Nothing. The sensation follows me all the way down the hill, a weight between my shoulder blades that no amount of rational thinking can shake off. By the time I reach my driveway, I'm running faster than my usual training pace. My breathing harsh and ragged in the morning quiet. At home, I shower and make coffee with hands that shake slightly as I measure the grounds. The normalcy of domestic routine should calm me. But instead, I find myself checking and rechecking the door locks, peering out windows at the empty street. The hill looms beyond the valley, its familiar silhouette somehow ominous in the growing daylight. I spend the day researching Serpentine Ridge online, diving deep into local history forums and university archaeological databases. What I find makes my morning unease crystallize into something sharper and more defined. The Miwok considered the hill to be a place of power, a spot where the boundary between worlds grew thin. Their shamans would fast there for days, seeking visions that would guide their people through seasons of plenty or hardship. But it was also a place of testing where young warriors proved their courage by spending a night alone on the summit. Not all of them came back down unchanged. The early settlers avoided the hill entirely, though their journals don't say why. Just vague references to unnatural occurrences and warnings passed down from the surviving Miwok families. It wasn't until the gold rush brought desperate men with no respect for indigenous wisdom that anyone tried to build there. 3 different mining claims were filed and abandoned between 1851 and 1854. The prospectors reported equipment failures, tools that moved on their own, and the persistent feeling of being watched by hostile eyes. In 1923, a group of Stanford anthropologists conducted a dig on the hill's eastern slope. Their published report is clinically dry, focused on pottery fragments and stone tool analysis. But the personal journal of the lead researcher, digitized and archived years later, tells a different story. He writes about team members who claim to see figures walking among the oak trees at dusk, always at the edge of vision, always gone when looked at directly, about the way their surveying equipment malfunctioned, compass needles spinning wildly, measurement devices returning impossible readings. The dig was abandoned after 6 weeks when 2 graduate students refused to return to the site. The final journal entry is a single line. Some places are not meant to be disturbed. By evening, I've convinced myself that suggestion and folklore are playing tricks on my mind. The human brain is remarkably good at finding patterns where none exist, at transforming random events into meaningful narratives. The spearheads are probably just natural stone formations that happen to look like artifacts. The GPS glitch is a known issue with satellite reception in mountainous terrain. The feeling of being watched is nothing more than the hypervigilance that comes from spending too much time alone. But when I lie down to sleep, I find myself listening to every sound the old house makes as it settles for the night. Every creak of timber, every whisper of wind around the eaves. And somewhere in the distance, so faint I might be imagining it, the sound of footsteps moving in a slow, steady circle. The next morning, I wake before dawn with the absolute certainty that something is wrong. Not the gradual recognition that comes with full consciousness, but an immediate visceral knowledge that jolts me from sleep like an electric shock. The house feels different around me. Not empty, but occupied by a presence that doesn't belong. I dress in my running gear automatically. Muscle memory guiding me through the familiar routine while my mind struggles to understand what has changed. The morning is darker than usual. Thick clouds obscuring the pre-dawn stars. The air tastes metallic, charged with the promise of a storm that might never break. The hill calls to me with an urgency I've never felt before. Not the pleasant anticipation of exercise and solitude, but something deeper and more compulsive. A magnetic pull that draws me out of the house and up the road before I'm fully aware of moving. The deer path is muddy despite the lack of recent rain, and my footprints fill with water that seeps up from some underground source. The familiar landmarks, the lightning-struck oak, the boulder shaped like a crouching bear, seem subtly wrong, as if someone has moved them slightly to the left or right. The distance feels compressed, time folding in on itself so that I reach the summit with no clear memory of the climb. There are 7 spearheads waiting for me this time, arranged in a perfect circle around the spot where I always stop to catch my breath. Each one is flawless, recently made, beaded with moisture that reflects the grey sky like tiny mirrors. They weren't there yesterday. I would have noticed a display this elaborate, this deliberate. I stand in the center of the circle, slowly turning to take in the full pattern. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Each point carved with symbols I don't recognize but somehow understand. They speak of boundaries and warnings, of ancient agreements that should not be broken, of consequences for those who trespass on sacred ground without permission or proper preparation. The feeling of being watched intensifies until it becomes almost unbearable. Not the casual observation of a curious animal, but the focused attention of something intelligent and deeply offended by my presence. I can feel its gaze like heat on my skin, like pressure in my inner ear. When I turn slowly in place, trying to locate the source, shadows seem to shift and flow at the edges of my vision. My phone buzzes with an incoming text, the sound shockingly loud in the absolute silence. The message is from an unknown number. Just GPS coordinates that match my exact location. Below that, a single word. Why? I look up from the screen to find that the landscape has changed around me. The familiar oak grove has been replaced by unfamiliar terrain. Older trees with bark like scarred skin. Rock formations that jut from the earth like broken bones. The morning light has a quality I've never seen before. Yellow, green, and sickly as if filtered through something organic and dying. But when I check my GPS, the purple line shows the same perfect circle it always has. According to the satellite, I'm exactly where I've always been, following the same route I've traced every morning for weeks. The disconnect between what I see and what the technology records makes my head swim with vertigo. I start running, not the controlled pace of my usual workout, but a panicked sprint down what I hope is the familiar path home. The ground beneath my feet feels unstable, yielding in ways that dirt and stone should not. Behind me, I can hear the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something more fundamental, like the earth itself rearranging in my wake. Branches that weren't there moments ago reach out to snag my clothes and scratch my arms. Roots emerge from the trail to trip me, sending me stumbling forward with barely controlled momentum. The air grows thicker with each breath, as if I'm running through honey instead of atmosphere. When I finally break free of the treant, my house sits exactly where it should be, normal and welcoming in the ordinary morning light. The sensation of pursuit cuts off abruptly, leaving me gasping and shaking on my own front lawn. Birds sing in the distance. A neighbor's dog barks. Traffic hums from the main road. Everything is exactly as it should be, except for the 7 obsidian spearheads I find clutched in my right hand. Their edges sharp enough to draw blood from my palm without my noticing. I spend the rest of the day trying to convince myself that stress and isolation have finally caught up with me. That months of upheaval and change have pushed my mind past its breaking point into territory where hallucination feels more real than reality. The spearheads sit on my kitchen table like accusations, their impossible presence mocking every rational explanation I can construct. But when darkness falls and I try to sleep, I can hear them calling to me, not with sound, but with something deeper than hearing, a resonance that vibrates in my bones and pulls at something essential in my chest. The hill wants me back. Whatever I've awakened or disturbed or trespassed against isn't finished with me yet. And the terrible truth I can't quite bring myself to acknowledge is that part of me wants to answer that call. Part of me has been changed by these morning encounters, shaped by exposure to something beyond the mundane world I thought I understood. The runner who started training on Serpentine Ridge 6 weeks ago no longer exists. In his place stands someone else. Someone marked by contact with forces that predate human civilization by millennia. Tomorrow morning, I know I'll run again. The GPS will trace its perfect circles while I experience something else entirely. And somewhere on that hill, new spearheads will be waiting to mark another boundary crossed. Another step deeper into territory where the rules of ordinary reality no longer apply. The phone glows beside my bed, the purple line of tomorrow's route already traced across the screen like a prophecy written in digital ink. In the morning, I'll run that impossible circle one more time, chasing answers that retreat like shadows at the edge of vision. But tonight, lying in the darkness, I can finally admit what I've known since the first spearhead appeared: I'm no longer running away from something. I'm running toward it. Story 7. The headlights carved through the darkness like surgical instruments, revealing nothing but endless scrubland punctuated by the skeletal remains of dead trees. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter as our rental car bounced over another pothole. The camera equipment in the back rattling like bones in a coffin. 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in the Nevada desert, where cell towers fear to tread, we'd finally found it. The bunker that had haunted Jake's research for months. It squatted against the horizon like a concrete tumor, its entrance sealed with rusted steel that caught our headlights and threw the light back at us in jagged fragments. Perfect, Jake whispered from the passenger seat, his breath fogging the window as he pressed his face against the glass. His obsession with abandoned military sites had brought us to some godforsaken places before, but nothing quite like this. The silence here felt different. Not empty, but full of something that made the hair on my arms stand at attention. I killed the engine. The sudden absence of mechanical noise should have been a relief. But instead, it felt like we just turned off life support. The desert silence pressed against the windows, heavy and expectant. "You sure about this place?" I asked. Though I already knew Jake's answer. He'd been planning this shoot for weeks, ever since he'd found the declassified documents mentioning the facility's unusual geological properties, whatever that meant. Marcus stepped out first, his boots crunching on the hard pan. He was already assembling his drone, fingers moving with practiced efficiency despite the darkness. The LED indicators blinked like digital fireflies as he ran through his pre-flight checks. The bunker loomed 50 yards away, its concrete walls scarred by decades of wind and sand. According to Jake's research, it had been abandoned in the late 70s after some kind of accident. The files were heavily redacted, but whatever happened had been significant enough to make the military pack up and leave overnight. I stepped out into the desert air, immediately struck by how still everything was. No wind, no insects, no distant highway hum. Just us in the bunker and the vast emptiness that seemed to press in from all sides. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset, but the cold felt wrong somehow. Not the clean cold of mountain air, but something that seemed to seep up from the ground itself. "First shot in 5, Marcus called out, his voice unnaturally loud in the stillness. The drone's rotors began their familiar whine. A sound that should have been comforting in its normally, but instead felt like an intrusion, as if we were disturbing something that preferred to remain undisturbed. Jake was already setting up his ground-based equipment. Tripods emerging from cases like mechanical spiders. His movements were quick, almost frantic, driven by the kind of excitement that only came when he sensed he was on to something special. I'd seen that look before, usually right before we stumbled into situations that made me question why I'd ever agreed to these midnight expeditions. The drone lifted off with a soft electric hum, its lights tracing geometric patterns against the star-studded sky. Marcus guided it toward the bunker with the fluid movements of someone who'd spent years mastering the dance between technology and art. Through his controller's screen, we watched the bunker resolve into sharp detail. Concrete walls thick enough to withstand a nuclear blast, ventilation shafts that disappeared into darkness, and something else. "Hold it right there," Jake said, squinting at the screen. "You see that?" Marcus froze the drone's position. In the infrared display, strange patterns emerge from the ground around the bunker's base. Not quite geometric, not quite organic. Like someone had carved flowing script into the desert floor in a language that predated human speech. "Just sand patterns," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. The formations were too deliberate, too purposeful. They radiated outward from the bunker in concentric rings, as if the structure itself was the center of some vast, invisible mandala. "Take the shot," Jake urged. His camera already firing rapid bursts from his position near our car. The drone's camera clicked once, a sound barely audible over the electric whine of its rotors. In that instant, I felt something shift. Not visually, not audibly, but in some deeper sense that made my stomach clench with primitive alarm. "Did you feel that?" I asked, but neither of them seemed to have noticed anything unusual. They were both absorbed in their work. Jake adjusting his camera settings while Marcus maneuvered the drone for a different angle. I turned back toward our car and stopped dead. There, where smooth desert floor had been just moments before, a low ridge of stones emerged from the sand like a partially submerged spine. The formation ran roughly parallel to our vehicle, maybe 3 feet away from the rear bumper. "Guys," I called out, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Look at this." But they were setting up for another shot, and my words seemed to dissolve into the desert air without reaching them. I walked closer to the stone ridge, kneeling to examine it more closely. The rocks weren't scattered randomly. They were fitted together with the precision of ancient masonry, each piece shaped to interlock with its neighbors in ways that spoke of intelligence and purpose. The drone's camera clicked again. This time, I definitely felt the shift, a subtle tremor that seemed to originate not from the ground beneath my feet, but from somewhere much deeper. The stone ridge had grown, extending several more feet in both directions. More disturbing, a second ridge was emerging on the opposite side of the car, creating the beginning of what looked like a narrow corridor. "Marcus, bring the drone back," I said louder this time. But he was absorbed in his viewfinder, making minute adjustments to the aircraft's position. "Just a couple more shots," he called back. "The lighting is perfect." The lighting. I looked up at the moon, which had been a thin crescent when we'd arrived. Now it seemed fuller, casting stronger shadows that made the desert floor look like a patchwork of light and dark. But that was impossible. The moon didn't change phases in the span of an hour. Another click from the drone's camera. Another subtle tremor. The stone ridges were now clearly visible as low walls, rising about knee-high and running parallel to each other on either side of our car. They extended back toward the bunker in one direction and forward into the empty desert in the other, as if we'd parked in the middle of some ancient roadway that was slowly revealing itself. "We need to leave," I said. But my voice came out as barely a whisper. Something about the situation was sapping my strength, making it difficult to form words or even think clearly. The cold was getting worse, too, seeping through my jacket and settling into my bones with an insistence that felt almost alive. Jake had moved closer to the bunker, his camera firing in rapid bursts as he documented something I couldn't see from my position. His silhouette was dark against the concrete wall, and for a moment, I could have sworn there were other silhouettes moving behind him. Tall, thin shapes that seemed to flow rather than walk. "Jake," I shouted, finding my voice again. He turned toward me, his face pale in the moonlight. "The walls," he called back, his voice carrying a note of excitement that made my blood run cold. "They're everywhere. Concentric circles all radiating out from the bunker. It's like the whole desert is laid out in some kind of pattern." I looked around and saw that he was right. What I'd initially taken for random stone ridges were actually the remnants of an enormous geometric design carved into the landscape itself. Our car sat at the intersection of several of these stone pathways, and with each passing moment, the walls seemed to be growing higher, more defined. Another camera click from above. The walls around our car were now waist-high, and I noticed with growing alarm that they were no longer just on two sides. Stone barriers were emerging all around us, creating what was beginning to look like a rectangular enclosure. "Marcus, get that thing down now," I yelled, my voice cracking with panic. He finally looked up from his controller, blinking as if he'd been in some kind of trance. "What's wrong?" I gestured at the walls that were now clearly visible in the moonlight, rising from the desert floor like the bones of some massive creature struggling to resurrect itself. Marcus stared for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally fear. "That's impossible," he whispered. But impossible or not, the walls continued to grow. They were chest-high now, composed of fitted stones that looked ancient beyond measure. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Each block carved and placed with mathematical precision, the joints so tight that not even desert sand could find purchase between them. Jake had stopped taking pictures and was running back toward us, his equipment abandoned near the bunker. "We need to document this," he panted as he reached us. "This is the discovery of a lifetime. Some kind of automated defense system maybe. Or we need to leave," I interrupted, grabbing him by the shoulders right now. But when I turned toward our car, I realized that leaving might no longer be an option. The walls had grown to shoulder height and completely encircled our vehicle. What had started as a few scattered stones had become a perfectly rectangular stone enclosure, maybe 20 feet on each side, with our rental car trapped in the center like a museum exhibit. The drone was still hovering overhead, its camera periodically clicking as it continued its programmed routine. With each photograph, the wall seemed to respond, growing incrementally higher. I could see now that this wasn't random. The structure was reacting to being observed, to being recorded. Every time the camera captured an image, the ancient mechanism buried beneath the desert floor awakened a little more. "Turn it off," I told Marcus, my voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Turn everything off." He fumbled with the controller, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the controls. The drone continued its slow orbit above us, its LED lights tracing patterns against the stars. The walls were now taller than any of us, rising 7 or 8 feet from the desert floor. But they weren't just rising, they were also moving inward. The rectangular space gradually contracting. At the current rate, we had maybe an hour before the walls reached the car itself. "This isn't possible," Marcus kept repeating, his voice getting higher with each iteration. "Stone doesn't grow. Rock doesn't move like this." But the evidence was all around us, undeniable and increasingly claustrophobic. The walls continued their slow, inexorable advance, driven by some mechanism that predated our understanding of physics or engineering. I pressed my back against the car's hood and tried to think rationally. The bunker, the declassified documents, the unusual geological properties, whatever experiments had been conducted here decades ago, they'd left something behind, something that responded to observation, to the act of recording. The drone's battery finally died, and the aircraft settled gently onto the car's roof with a soft metallic thunk. In the sudden absence of its electric whine, the desert silence rushed back in like a tide. But it wasn't empty silence anymore. There were sounds now, subtle, but unmistakable. The whisper of sand shifting against stone, the almost inaudible groan of rock under tremendous pressure, and underneath it all, something that might have been breathing. If breath could come from the earth itself. "Look at the stars," Jake whispered. I tilted my head back and felt my knees nearly buckle. The constellation patterns were wrong, not dramatically, but subtly, as if someone had taken the familiar star map and shifted everything just slightly to the left. The North Star wasn't where it should be. The Big Dipper looked like it had been stirred with a cosmic spoon. Either the entire universe had shifted around us, or we were no longer quite where we'd started. "The walls," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "They're not just growing up, they're growing down, too." He was right. What I'd initially taken for walls rising from the desert floor were actually the upper portions of much larger structures that were excavating themselves. Through gaps in the stonework, I could see deeper levels, chambers, and corridors that extended far below ground level. We weren't being walled in. We were being lowered into something. The rectangular enclosure around our car was actually the top of a shaft. And with each passing moment, we were sinking deeper into the earth while the walls rose higher around us. The desert floor that had seemed so solid was apparently nothing more than a thin crust over vast underground chambers. "How long have we been here?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Marcus checked his watch and went very still. According to this, we arrived 6 hours ago. But that was impossible. The sun should have been coming up by now. Yet, the darkness seemed deeper than ever, and the moon, when I could see it through the narrow opening above us, looked like it was moving backward across the sky. "Time doesn't work right here," Jake said, his voice eerily calm. "The documents mentioned temporal anomalies. I thought it was just military doublespeak, but he trailed off, staring at something behind me. I turned to see that one wall of our enclosure had developed what looked like a doorway. Not an opening, but a passage that seemed to lead deeper into the structure. Faint light emanated from within, not electric, but organic, as if the walls themselves were luminescent. "We could explore," Jake suggested, his scientific curiosity apparently overriding his survival instincts. "This might be our only chance to see what they built down here. Or we could wait," I countered. "Maybe when the sun comes up, this will all reverse itself." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The mechanism we'd awakened with our cameras and drones operated on a different schedule entirely. Dawn and dusk meant nothing down here, where time itself seemed to flow differently. The walls had stopped rising, leaving us in a stone chamber roughly 15 foot square with our car sitting in the center like an offering on an altar. The desert above was now just a distant memory, visible only as a small rectangle of star-filled sky far overhead. Marcus had begun pacing, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls with a sound that didn't quite match his movements. "This is some kind of containment system," he said, his voice taking on the rapid cadence of someone trying to solve a puzzle before panic set in completely. "They built it to respond to observation. Every time we documented it, we triggered another stage of the sequence. Then maybe if we stop looking, it'll stop moving," I suggested. But it was too late for that. We'd already seen too much, recorded too much. The ancient system buried beneath the Nevada desert had awakened after decades of slumber, and it was following programming written in stone and starlight by minds that had understood principles we were only beginning to glimpse. The luminous doorway pulsed gently, almost rhythmically, like a heartbeat made of light. From somewhere deep within the structure came sounds that might have been machinery or might have been something else entirely. A low thrumming resonance that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. "We have to choose," Jake said finally. "Go deeper or wait here," until he didn't finish the sentence, but we all understood. Until whatever had built this place decided what to do with us. Until the walls started moving again. Until the small rectangle of sky above us disappeared entirely. I looked up at the stars one more time, noting how they continued their slow, impossible dance across the inverted sky. The moon was definitely moving backward now, its phases shifting in reverse, as if time itself was being unwound. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of more walls rising from the desert floor, more chambers excavating themselves, more ancient machinery stirring to life after decades of patient waiting. Our cameras had awakened something vast and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. And the most terrifying part wasn't that we were trapped. It was the growing certainty that this had all happened before. That other explorers, other photographers, other curious minds had found this place and triggered the same sequence. That somewhere in the deeper chambers, we might find evidence of previous visitors who had made the same choice we were about to make. The ground beneath our feet hummed with hidden energy, and the walls around us seemed to pulse with ancient purpose. Above us, the stars continued their backward dance, and below us, corridors of fitted stone stretched away into phosphorescent darkness. We had become part of something larger than ourselves, something that existed in the spaces between seconds and the gaps between heartbeats. And as the luminous doorway beckoned us deeper into the earth, I realized that the choice we thought we were making, to explore or to wait, had been made for us long before we'd ever set foot in this place. The ground remembers everything. And now, whether we wanted to or not, we were going to help it remember us, too. Story 8. The salt air carried more than ocean spray that night. It carried something else. Something that made my skin crawl even before I saw it. I should have known then. Should have trusted that primal instinct that made my hands shake as I turned the key in the driftwood's front door. But I was just doing my job, closing up like I had every night for the past 3 years, following the same routine that had become as automatic as breathing. The driftwood sat on weathered pilings 20 feet above the churning Pacific, connected to shore by a narrow boardwalk that swayed with each gust of wind. During the day, tourists loved the sensation of dining over open water, watching waves crash against the rocks below through gaps between the deck planks. At night, though, the restaurant took on a different character entirely. The sounds became amplified. Every creak of timber, every splash of water against the foundation, every whistle of wind through the railing seemed to echo with an almost orchestral precision. I had always been the last to leave. Manager's orders. Someone responsible had to ensure everything was secure, all equipment turned off, all doors locked. The other servers and kitchen staff usually cleared out by 10:30, leaving me alone with the dishwasher hum and the constant rhythm of waves. That night felt no different as I made my rounds, checking that the gas lines were shut off, the walk-in cooler sealed, the register drawer removed and locked in the office safe. The floating terrace extended from the main dining room like an afterthought, a recent addition that the owner had installed to maximize seating during peak season. It was essentially a large platform suspended over the water by cables and pontoons, accessible through sliding glass doors that ran the length of the restaurant's ocean-facing wall. During service, those doors stayed open, allowing the sound and smell of the sea to permeate the dining experience. At night, I always made sure they were locked tight. Insurance requirements, the owner had explained, though he never specified against what. I was wiping down the last of the interior tables when I noticed them. The glass doors that should have been secured were standing open, salting air flowing freely into the dining room. The oversight irritated me. One of the other servers must have forgotten to close them properly. And now I'd have to mop up the moisture that had inevitably accumulated on the hardwood floors. As I approached the doors, cloth still in hand, the sounds from outside seemed to shift. The regular percussion of waves against the pilings gained an additional rhythm, something that didn't quite match the natural tempo of the tide. It was subtle at first, like a drummer slightly off-beat in an otherwise perfectly synchronized orchestra. I paused, listening, trying to identify the source of the discordance. That's when I saw it. On the floating terrace, partially obscured by the shadow cast by the restaurant's main structure, stood a figure. At first glance, it appeared to be a person, human in shape and size, though completely motionless despite the terrace's gentle swaying. But as my eyes adjusted to the interplay of moonlight and shadow, details that should have been there simply weren't. The figure cast no reflection in the glass doors beside me. I could see everything else clearly mirrored in the polished surface, the interior lights, my own form clutching the damp cloth, even the pattern of waves visible through the terrace planking. But where the figure stood, the reflection showed only empty space, as if nothing existed there at all. My rational mind immediately began crafting explanations. A trick of the light, perhaps, or some optical illusion created by the restaurant's positioning relative to the moon. Maybe condensation on the glass was distorting the reflection, or my eyes were simply tired after a long shift. But even as I constructed these reasonable possibilities, my body was responding to something deeper, more primal. My pulse quickened and a cold sweat began forming. Despite the evening's warmth, I stepped closer to the glass, pressing my face against it to get a better view. The figure remained perfectly still, darker than the shadows around it, like a piece of night sky that had detached itself and taken human form. It appeared to be facing the restaurant, though I couldn't make out any features. No face, no clothing details, nothing that would identify it as definitively human rather than some elaborate scarecrow or decoration. But decorations don't breathe. And this thing was definitely breathing. I could see the slight expansion and contraction of its form, rhythmic and deliberate, matching the strange additional beat I'd been hearing in the waves below. It was as if the ocean itself was responding to the figure's presence, adjusting its natural rhythm to accommodate something that shouldn't exist. I tried calling out, thinking perhaps someone had wandered onto the terrace after hours, a confused tourist or vagrant seeking shelter. But my voice seemed to die in my throat, absorbed by the salt air before it could travel the few feet to where the figure stood. The sound simply vanished, leaving only the modified rhythm of water against wood. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The figure never moved, never acknowledged my presence, never gave any indication that it was aware of being observed. I found myself studying it with growing unease, noting how its form seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, how the shadows around it appeared deeper and more substantial than they should have been. Eventually, my legs began to ache from standing motionless, and I realized I had been holding my breath for an uncomfortably long time. I stepped back from the glass, breaking the strange spell that had held me transfixed. When I looked back up, the terrace was empty. Not empty in the way of something having departed, but empty as if nothing had ever been there at all. The shadows had returned to their normal depths. The waves resumed their natural rhythm, and the terrace swayed gently in the ocean breeze exactly as it should have. I might have convinced myself the entire episode was imagination, if not for one detail. The glass doors were still open, letting in the salt air that now felt somehow different. Charged with an energy that made my skin prickle, I closed and locked the doors with trembling hands, then completed my closing routine with mechanical precision, desperate for the comfort of familiar tasks. But as I gathered my keys and prepared to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by something on the terrace I had checked repeatedly and it remained empty, but by something else, something that had used the figure as a way of announcing its presence. The walk across the boardwalk to shore felt longer than usual, each footstep echoing off the water below with unusual clarity. I found myself glancing back at the restaurant repeatedly, half expecting to see the figure again, but the building remained dark and apparently empty. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I had been practically running. Sleep came fitfully that night. I kept waking to the sound of waves, though I lived 3 miles inland, and twice I caught myself checking that my bedroom windows were properly locked. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that I had simply been tired, that the long shift and the play of shadows had created an optical illusion that my imagination had transformed into something more sinister. But a deeper part of me, the part that had existed long before civilization taught us to dismiss such primal fears, remained convinced that I had witnessed something genuinely wrong. The next morning brought no relief. I arrived at work early, hoping that daylight would dispel the previous night's unease. But the restaurant felt different somehow. The usual sounds, seagulls, lapping waves, creaking timber, seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The other staff members appeared unaffected, going about their preparation routines with normal efficiency, but I found myself constantly glancing toward the glass doors that led to the floating terrace. During the lunch rush, I made excuses to walk past those doors frequently, studying the terrace in bright sunlight. Everything appeared completely normal. Tables and chairs arranged neatly, railings secure, planking solid underfoot. When I finally worked up the courage to step outside, there was something about the far corner. The spot where I had seen the figure that felt different. Not visibly different. The shadows fell exactly as they should. The planking showed no unusual wear or discoloration, but different in a way that my body registered, even if my eyes couldn't identify the source. It was Maria, one of the other servers, who mentioned the security cameras. The owner had installed them 6 months earlier after a series of break-ins at waterfront businesses, and they recorded everything that happened on the premises between closing and opening. If something had actually been on the terrace the night before, there would be evidence. The footage was stored on a digital system in the manager's office, accessible through a simple computer interface. I waited until the afternoon lull when most of the staff was taking their break before slipping into the office and pulling up the previous night's recording. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m. when I appeared on screen, making my final rounds, wiping down tables with the methodical efficiency of long practice. I fast-forwarded to the moment when I had approached the glass doors, watching my digital self pause and peer out at the terrace. On the recording, I could see myself pressing against the glass, staring intently at something outside the camera's range. The timestamp showed I remained in that position for nearly 8 minutes, though it had felt like only moments in real time. But when the camera angle switched to the exterior view that covered the floating terrace, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The terrace was empty, completely, utterly empty. During the entire time I had been staring at it, the recording showed only the gentle sway of the platform, the regular rhythm of waves below, and the occasional flutter of seabird wings across the frame. Yet, something was wrong with the image itself. The waves beneath the terrace moved in a pattern that seemed slightly off, as if responding to some presence that the camera couldn't detect. Tables and chairs shifted almost imperceptibly, not in the random way that wind would move them, but with a subtle coordination that suggested external influence. It was the same rhythm I had heard the night before, the additional beat that had disrupted the ocean's natural tempo. I watched the footage 3 times, studying every frame, looking for any evidence of tampering or malfunction. But the recording appeared genuine, the timestamp consistent, the image quality clear and undistorted. According to the camera, nothing had been on the terrace except the furniture and the shadows they cast in the moonlight. The implications were deeply disturbing. Either the recording equipment had somehow failed to capture something that was genuinely there, or I had experienced a hallucination so vivid and detailed that I had remained motionless for 8 minutes, staring at empty space while convinced I was observing an intruder. Neither possibility offered much comfort. I closed the video file and returned to work, but the knowledge of what I had seen or failed to see gnawed at me throughout the rest of my shift. Customers seemed to sense my distraction, and I found myself making small errors that I hadn't made since my first week on the job. The manager noticed and suggested I take a long weekend, which under normal circumstances would have been welcome. But the thought of being away from the restaurant, of not knowing what might happen during my absence, filled me with the anxiety that I couldn't quite explain. That night, as closing time approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating the ritual of locking up. Part of me hoped that whatever I had experienced was a one-time occurrence, an anomaly that wouldn't repeat itself. But another part, the part that had watched those waves move in impossible rhythm on the security footage, knew that I needed to see the terrace again to confirm or deny what my eyes had reported. The other staff members left on schedule, calling out their usual good nights as they headed for the parking lot. I completed my closing checklist with extra care, double-checking every lock, every appliance, every safety procedure the owner had drilled into us during training. But as I approached the glass doors leading to the floating terrace, my hands began to shake again. The doors were closed this time, locked as they should have been. Through the glass, the terrace appeared exactly as it had in the security footage, empty, peaceful, swaying gently in the ocean breeze. Moonlight cast familiar shadows across the planking, and waves lapped against the pontoons with their natural, unmodified rhythm. I stood there for several minutes, studying every corner of the platform, looking for any sign of the presence I had felt so strongly the night before. Everything appeared normal, almost aggressively normal, as if the terrace was trying too hard to convince me that nothing unusual had ever happened there. But as I prepared to turn away, Satisfied that the previous night had indeed been some kind of hallucination or misperception, I noticed something that made my stomach clench with renewed fear. In the glass doors beside me, I could see my own reflection clearly. Tired face, rumpled uniform, keys clutched in one hand. I could see the interior of the restaurant behind me, the arrangement of tables and chairs, the soft glow of the emergency lighting. But I could also see something else. Standing behind my reflection, partially obscured by the angle of the glass, was another figure, not on the terrace this time, but inside the restaurant with me. Close enough that I should have been able to hear its breathing. Close enough to reach out and touch. I spun around, hard hammering, but found only empty space. The dining room stretched out exactly as it should have. Every table in its proper place, every chair pushed in at the correct angle. The emergency lights cast their usual soft circles of illumination, revealing nothing that shouldn't have been there. When I turned back to the glass doors, both reflections were gone. Mine and the other one. The polished surface showed only the exterior view of the terrace, waves glittering in the moonlight, shadows dancing across planking that suddenly seemed far less solid than it had moments before. I ran then, abandoning all pretense of dignity or professional composure. My footsteps echoed through the empty restaurant as I headed for the exit, keys jangling frantically as I fumbled with the locks. The boardwalk seemed to stretch endlessly as I fled toward shore, each footfall on the wooden plank sounding like gunshots in the otherwise quiet night. It wasn't until I reached my car that I realized I was laughing. High, breathless sounds that bordered on hysteria. The rational part of my mind was already constructing explanations, suggesting that stress and exhaustion had finally taken their toll, that I needed to see a doctor or take some time off or perhaps find a different line of work altogether. But as I drove away from the driftwood, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me from the restaurant. Not physically, I could see in my mirrors that the road behind me was empty, but something less tangible, something that had attached itself to me during those minutes of staring at reflections that shouldn't have existed. The next morning brought a phone call from my manager. The security system had malfunctioned during the night, he explained. All the cameras going offline simultaneously around midnight. The recording from the previous evening was also corrupted, he added. The files showing nothing but static when he tried to review them. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual during my closing routine, anything that might explain the technical problems. I told him no, that everything had seemed normal, that I hadn't encountered any issues with the equipment or the building itself. The lie came easily, automatically, as if some part of me had been preparing it even before he asked the question. He seemed satisfied with my response and reminded me that I was scheduled to work the closing shift again that evening. I agreed, promised I would be there on time, and hung up the phone with hands that shook only slightly because I knew I would return to the driftwood, would approach those glass doors again, would look for reflections that revealed more than they should. Not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Something had been set in motion during those first moments of contact. Some process that couldn't be stopped by simply avoiding the restaurant or finding another job. The figure on the terrace, whether real or imagined, had been an invitation, a test of my willingness to see beyond the comfortable boundaries of normal perception, and I had passed that test, had proven myself capable of witnessing things that security cameras couldn't record, things that existed in the spaces between what was real and what was possible. Now, as I sit here preparing for another night at the driftwood, I find myself wondering not whether I will see the figure again, but what it will show me next. Because I understand now that it was never really on the terrace at all. It was always inside, always reflected in surfaces that revealed truth rather than mere appearance. Always waiting for someone willing to look closely enough to see it. The waves that moved in impossible rhythm. The shadows that fell deeper than they should have. The reflections that showed what cameras couldn't capture. They had all been preparing me for this moment of recognition. The moment when I finally understood that the boundary between observer and observed, between the one who watches and the one who is watched, was far more fluid than I had ever imagined. Tonight, when I lock up the driftwood, I won't run. I'll stand at those glass doors for as long as it takes, studying every reflection, every shadow, every subtle distortion of light and perception. And when I finally see clearly what has been trying to show itself to me, I suspect I'll discover that the question was never whether the figure was real. The question was whether I was. Story 9. The first thing you need to understand is that I wasn't running away from anything supernatural that Tuesday afternoon. I was running from Derek Morrison and his pack of jackals the same way I'd been running for 3 months since transferring to Millbrook High. The bruise on my ribs still HDHD from yesterday's encounter by the lockers. And when I saw them waiting for me after final period, grinning like hyenas who'd cornered wounded prey, I made the only rational choice available. I bolted. The October air bit at my lungs as I sprinted across the parking lot, my backpack bouncing against my spine with each desperate stride. Behind me, their voices carried on the wind. Derek's distinctive laugh mixing with the others in a chorus that made my skin crawl. I could hear their footsteps on the asphalt, growing closer despite my head start. The forest beckoned at the edge of school property, a wall of amber and crimson that had been calling to me for weeks. I'd never ventured into those woods before, always taking the long way around on my walk home. But desperation makes cowards of us all. The treant swallowed me whole, and suddenly the world transformed from suburban mediocrity into something altogether more primitive. Branches clawed at my jacket as I pushed deeper into the undergrowth, following what might have been a deer trail through the maze of oak and maple. The canopy above filtered the afternoon light into shifting patterns that danced across the forest floor. And for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe I might be safe. The sounds of pursuit had faded, replaced by the whisper of wind through dying leaves and the distant call of some unseen bird. That's when I first noticed the silence. It crept up on me gradually, like a tide rolling in reverse. The bird calls ceased. The rustle of small creatures in the underbrush stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving me alone with the sound of my own ragged breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath my sneakers. I paused, pressing my back against the rough bark of an ancient oak, and listened. Nothing. The forest had become a cathedral of stillness, and I was the only congregation member brave enough or foolish enough to remain. My rational mind insisted this was normal, that wildlife often went quiet when larger predators moved through their territory. But some deeper instinct, some primal part of my brain that remembered when humans huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay, whispered that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. I pushed forward anyway, driven by the fear that Eric and his friends might still be searching for me along the forest edge. The trail meandered between massive tree trunks, their bark scarred by decades of weather and time. Moss covered everything like a green carpet, muffling my footsteps until I moved through the woods like a ghost haunting his own life. That's when the first flash appeared. It lasted perhaps a fraction of a second. A brilliant azure light that seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once, illuminating the forest in electric blue before vanishing completely. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed for flight or fight. But the woods had returned to their unnatural quiet. I waited, counting my heartbeats. But nothing else happened. Trick of the light, I told myself. Sunlight filtering through the canopy at just the right angle to create an optical illusion. It happened all the time in nature documentaries. Perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. I took another step forward and heard the soft whisper of something falling behind me, like a photograph sliding off a table. When I turned, my breath caught in my throat. There, pressed into the soft earth where my left foot had been moments before, was an image of my sneaker tread pattern. But this wasn't a normal footprint. This was something else entirely. A perfect reproduction of my show's sole rendered in what looked like silver nitrate on photographic paper, complete with the distinctive wear pattern on the heel and the small pebble lodged in one of the treads. I knelt beside it, reaching out with trembling fingers, but stopped short of actually touching the thing. It looked exactly like a Polaroid photograph, the kind my grandfather used to take at family gatherings, except this one showed only the bottom of my shoe against a background of forest floor. The image was so crisp, so impossibly detailed that I could make out individual grains of dirt clinging to the rubber sole. As I watched, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure, the edges of the photograph began to curl slightly, as if exposed to heat. The image itself remained sharp, but something about its presence felt temporary, ephemeral, like morning frost that would vanish with the first touch of sunlight. I stood on shaking legs and took several steps backward, my eyes never leaving the impossible thing on the ground. Another flash of blue light erupted around me, lasting just long enough for me to see my own shadow thrown in stark relief against the surrounding trees. When my vision cleared, I looked down to find another photograph. This one capturing the print of my right foot. My mind reeled, grasping for rational explanations that slipped away like water through cupped hands. Some kind of chemical reaction in the soil. A new species of bioluminescent fungus that somehow recorded images. The theory sounded ridiculous, even in the privacy of my own thoughts. But the alternative, that something in these woods was photographing my every step, seemed far worse. I began to walk again, faster now, driven by a growing need to escape whatever force was documenting my passage through this place. But with each step, the blue flashes came more frequently, sometimes catching me mid-stride, sometimes waiting until I'd planted both feet firmly on the ground. Behind me, a trail of silver photographs marked my route like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale gone wrong. The forest around me began to change subtly. The trees seemed taller, their branches reaching higher into the sky until they disappeared into shadows that shouldn't have existed in the middle of the afternoon. The undergrowth grew thicker, forcing me to push through curtains of thorny vines that seemed to grab at my clothing with deliberate intent. Even the air felt different, heavier, somehow, pregnant with the weight of unseen observation. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It started as a prickle between my shoulder blades, the kind of sensation you get when someone stares at you from across a crowded room. But this was different. This felt vast and patient, like standing under a microscope operated by something with all the time in the world to study its specimen. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few steps, expecting to catch a glimpse of whatever was tracking my movement through the trees. The trail began to climb, winding up a gentle slope that forced me to watch my footing on the loose rocks and fallen branches. More blue flashes erupted around me, each one accompanied by the soft whisper of another photograph joining my growing archive. I tried changing direction, stepping off the path entirely to push through dense undergrowth. But the flashes followed me regardless of where I went. Soon, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The photographs weren't just recording where I'd been. They were appearing ahead of me as well. I first noticed it when I stopped to catch my breath beside a massive boulder that jutted from the hillside like a sleeping giant's shoulder. As I leaned against the cold stone, gasping in the thin air, a flash of blue light illuminated the area directly in front of me. When it faded, I saw a silver photograph lying on the ground perhaps 10 feet ahead. But this wasn't an image of a footprint. It was a picture of me. The photograph showed me from behind, captured in perfect detail as I leaned against the boulder. I could see the way my jacket hung on my shoulders, the exact pattern of mud stains on my jeans, even the way my hair stuck up at odd angles from pushing through the forest. But what made my skin crawl was the angle of the shot. It had been taken from above and behind as if something had been perched in the trees, looking down at me with the patience of a predator studying its prey. I approached the photograph with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. Like the footprint images, this one showed signs of aging even as I watched, the edges curling slightly, the surface developing the faint patina of something exposed to air and time. But the image itself remained disturbingly clear, a perfect capture of a moment that had ended mere seconds ago. The rational part of my mind, the part that still clung to science class explanations and logical thinking, insisted there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown brought on by months of constant stress and harassment. Maybe the isolation and fear had finally cracked something fundamental in my psyche, causing me to hallucinate elaborate scenarios that felt more real than reality itself. But the photographs were still there when I closed my eyes and opened them again. I began to run. The blue flashes came faster now, erupting around me like lightning in a thunderstorm that existed in spectrums beyond normal human perception. Each burst revealed another photograph appearing somewhere in my peripheral vision. Images of me climbing over fallen logs, ducking under low branches, stumbling over hidden roots. The pictures formed a comprehensive documentation of my passage through this place, a record being compiled by something that remained frustratingly invisible. The forest grew darker as I climbed higher, though my watch insisted it was still mid-afternoon. The canopy overhead seemed to thicken with each step, filtering the sunlight until only scattered beams penetrated to the forest floor. In the growing gloom, the blue flashes became more prominent, each one briefly transforming the woods into a supernatural landscape of electric shadows and silver light. I reached a clearing near the top of the hill, a circular space perhaps 30 feet across where no trees grew. The ground here was carpeted with photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered like leaves across the forest floor. All showed me at various points during my climb, me pushing through undergrowth, me stumbling over obstacles, me looking back over my shoulder with growing fear etched across my features. In the center of the clearing stood something that made me question every assumption I'd ever held about the nature of reality. It wasn't a structure exactly. It was more like an absence, a space where something should have been but wasn't. Outlined by the way light bent around its edges. I could sense its presence rather than see it directly. The way you might notice a cool spot in a warm room or feel the weight of silence in the middle of a conversation. As I stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to enter but unable to retreat, blue light began to emanate from the center of the space. Unlike the sudden flashes that had been following me, this was a steady glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. With each pulse, the photographs on the ground became more vivid, their silver surfaces reflecting the azure light like mirrors. That's when I noticed the dates. Each photograph bore a timestamp in the corner, printed in the distinctive font of old Polaroid cameras. But the dates were wrong. Some showed yesterday's date, others from last week, last month. A few bore dates from years in the future. As I walked carefully around the perimeter of the clearing, studying the scattered images, I began to recognize a pattern. They weren't just pictures of me in the forest. Some showed me walking to school, captured from impossible angles high above the street. Others showed me in my bedroom, photographed through windows that should have been blocked by walls. There were images of me sitting in classrooms, eating lunch in the cafeteria, even sleeping in my bed at night. The timestamps spanned months, creating an archive that documented every moment of my life with the obsessive thoroughness of a stalker. But the most disturbing photographs were the ones with future dates. These showed me in places I'd never been, doing things I'd never done. Me standing in the center of this very clearing, but older somehow. My face marked by years that hadn't yet passed. Me walking down unfamiliar streets in cities I didn't recognize. Me sitting in what looked like a doctor's office, speaking to someone outside the frame with an expression of profound sadness. One photograph dated exactly 1 year from today showed me standing in my childhood bedroom. But everything was wrong. The walls were covered with more photographs, thousands of them layered like wallpaper until no surface remained visible. And in the center of it all stood a figure I recognized as myself, but changed in ways I couldn't quite define. The person in the photograph was smiling, but the expression never reached his eyes. I backed away from the clearing, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. The rational explanations I'd been clinging to crumbled like sand castles before an incoming tide. This wasn't stress-induced hallucination or some bizarre natural phenomenon. This was something far worse. Something that had been watching me, recording me, possibly since the day I was born. The blue light pulsed brighter, and suddenly every photograph in the clearing began to move. Not like a movie or video, but with the subtle animation of things caught between dimensions. The figure in each image, me in all my captured moments, turned to look directly at where I stood at the edge of the clearing. Dozens of my own faces stared back at me with expressions ranging from confusion to terror to a hollow acceptance that made my stomach turn. Then they all smiled. I ran. Behind me, the forest erupted in continuous blue light, like a photographer's studio gone mad with strobing flashes. The photographs on the ground began to whisper as I passed. Not words exactly, but something that sounded almost like my own voice played backward at high speed. The trees seemed to bend inward as I ran, their branches reaching for me with wooden fingers that scraped against my jacket and caught in my hair. I have no clear memory of how I found my way out of the forest. One moment I was running through a maze of electric blue light and impossible photographs, and the next I was stumbling onto the familiar sidewalk that led back to town. The street lights were already flickering on, though my watch insisted it was still afternoon, and the ordinary sounds of suburban evening. Dogs barking, car doors slamming, the The distant hum of air conditioners seemed like messages from another world. I made it home somehow. My legs moving on autopilot while my mind struggled to process what I'd experienced. My parents barely looked up when I walked through the front door, mumbling something about homework and dinner before disappearing into their respective evening routines. I climbed the stairs to my room on unsteady legs, closed the door behind me, and collapsed onto my bed. That's when I noticed the envelope on my pillow. It was the size and shape of a photograph mailer, the kind used to protect prints during shipping. My name was written across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. Or maybe I did, but couldn't quite place where I'd seen it before. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. It showed me sitting on my bed holding the very envelope I just opened. The timestamp in the corner read today's date, but the time was 3 hours in the future. In the photograph, I was smiling that same empty smile I'd seen in the clearing. And pinned to the wall behind me were dozens of other photographs, all showing moments that hadn't happened yet. I'm writing this now because I need to document what's happening while I still remember it clearly. Because I can feel something changing in my mind, some fundamental shift in the way I perceive reality. The memories of the forest are becoming dreamlike, taking on the quality of something that might have been imagined. But the envelope on my pillow is real. The photograph inside is real, and as I write these words, I can see blue light beginning to flicker at the edges of my vision. Faint, but growing stronger with each passing moment. The forest may have let me go, but I don't think whatever lives there is finished with me yet. The sun set an hour ago, but when I look out my bedroom window, I can still see my footprints glowing faintly in the distance. Silver photographs scattered across the landscape like breadcrumbs leading back to something that knows my name and has been watching me far longer than I care to imagine. Tomorrow morning those photographs will fade with the sunrise just as they're supposed to. But I suspect they'll be back, and next time I won't have the luxury of running away because I'm beginning to understand that wherever I go, whatever I do, I'm already in the photograph. Story 10. The lake had always been wrong. I'd known it since childhood when my father first brought me to these waters with promises of bass and bluegill. Even then, at 8 years old, something about the stillness had made my skin crawl. The water was too dark, too quiet. Trees leaned over its edges like mourners at a grave, their reflections distorted and wavering even when no wind stirred the surface. 37 years later, I found myself returning to that same spot, driven by a restlessness I couldn't name. My divorce had been finalized 3 months ago. Sarah had taken the house, the dog, and most of my sense of purpose. The therapist Dr. Morgan had recommended said I needed to reconnect with activities that once brought me joy. Fishing, she'd suggested, noting how my eyes had lit up when I mentioned those old trips with my father. What a fool I'd been to think joy could be found in these waters. The morning mist clung to the lake like a shroud as I assembled my rod, hands trembling slightly from too much coffee and too little sleep. The familiar ritual should have been comforting, threading the line, selecting the lure, testing the drag. Instead, each motion felt rehearsed, as if I were an actor playing a part I'd forgotten how to inhabit. I cast the first line just as the sun crested the tree line, sending fingers of golden light across the water's surface. The lure, a bright red spinner that had been my father's favorite, disappeared beneath the dark mirror with barely a ripple. I settled onto the weathered dock, my breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. That's when I first saw it. Deep beneath the surface, perhaps 20 foot down, where the water turned from brown to black, something moved. At first, I convinced myself it was a fallen log or a large fish. But the shape was wrong. Too vertical, too intentional. I blinked hard, rubbing my eyes with the back of my free hand. The stress of the past year had been playing tricks on my vision. Floaters and strange shadows that Dr. Morrison assured me were perfectly normal for a man my age going through major life changes. But when I looked again, the shape was still there, clearer now. It was tall, impossibly tall, rising from the lake bed like a pillar of shadow, and it was watching me. My hands began to shake, nearly dropping the rod. The rational part of my mind offered explanations. A submerged tree trunk, a trick of light and shadow. The stress-induced hallucinations that had been plaguing me since the divorce proceedings began. But my body knew better. Every instinct screamed at me to reel in the line and leave this place. Instead, I found myself leaning forward, peering deeper into the water. The shape moved then, not with the random drift of debris, but with purpose. It lifted what I could only describe as an arm, though arm seemed too small a word for the appendage that stretched upward through the dark water. The gesture was unmistakable. It was beckoning me to cast again. My mouth went dry. The morning sounds, birds calling from the surrounding woods, the gentle lap of water against the dock, seemed to fade until all I could hear was the thundering of my own heartbeat. Every fiber of my being urged me to pack up and leave, but something stronger held me in place. A compulsion that felt both foreign and familiar, like a half-remembered dream. I reeled in the empty line. The red spinner should have been there, but it wasn't. With movements that felt disconnected from my own will, I reached into my tackle box and selected another lure, a small plastic worm. This time, my hands moved with practiced efficiency, tying the knot and checking the connection, while my eyes remained fixed on the shape below. It hadn't moved since that initial gesture, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. Waiting, I cast again. The lure hit the water with a soft plop and immediately vanished, not sinking naturally, but simply disappearing, as if the surface were a portal to somewhere else entirely. I felt a tug on the line, then nothing. When I reeled it in, the hook was empty once more. My right hand moved involuntarily to my coat pocket and froze. Something was there that hadn't been before. A small, hard object that my fingers recognized immediately. I pulled it out with a trembling hand. The plastic worm sat in my palm, completely dry, as if it had never touched water at all. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I stared at the lure, turning it over in my palm, searching for some logical explanation. Maybe I'd unconsciously pulled it from my tackle box. Maybe the morning cold was affecting my perception, making me imagine things that weren't there. But the shape in the water had moved again. That massive arm rising and falling in what could only be described as approval. I should have left then. Any sane person would have packed up their gear and driven home, perhaps even straight to Dr. Morgan's office. Instead, I found myself selecting another lure, then another. Each cast followed by the same impossible result. The bait would vanish upon touching the surface, only to reappear moments later in my pocket, bone dry and unmarked. With each repetition, the shape below grew clearer, more defined. What I had first taken for a massive human figure began to reveal details that made my skin crawl. The proportions were wrong. Arms too long, torso stretched beyond any natural limit. And there were protrusions from its back, things that swayed like kelp in an underwater current, but moved with too much intention to be anything so benign. The morning wore on, though time seemed to move differently here, stretching and contracting like the reflections on the water's surface. I became aware that I was no longer alone at the lake. Other fishermen had arrived, setting up at various points along the shoreline, but they seemed distant, their voices muffled as if filtered through cotton. When one of them, a heavy-set man in a red flannel shirt, waved and called out a friendly greeting, I found myself unable to respond. My voice stuck in my throat, and when I tried to wave back, my arm felt lean, unresponsive. The man's expression shifted from friendly to concerned, but when I blinked, he had turned away, apparently satisfied that I was simply antisocial rather than in distress. Could he see what I was seeing? Did the dark water reveal its secrets to him as well, or was I the only one chosen for this strange communion? The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. By midday, the sun had burned off most of the mist, revealing the lake in sharp detail. The water was clearer now, and I could see the shape with terrifying clarity. It was not human, had never been human, though it wore the rough approximation of human form like an ill-fitting costume. Its face, if face was the right word, was a smooth expanse broken only by what might have been eyes, dark holes that seemed to pull at my vision like whirlpools, and it was definitely watching me. Every cast brought the same result. Bait touching water, immediate disappearance, dry reappearance in my pocket. My jacket had grown heavy with accumulated lures, the weight pulling at my shoulders like an anchor. I had stopped questioning the impossibility of it, accepting the pattern as naturally as I accepted gravity or the movement of the sun across the sky. That acceptance should have terrified me more than the phenomenon itself. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, I noticed something else changing. The other fishermen along the shore were packing up their gear, their movements hurried, almost frantic. They glanced repeatedly at the water, then at me, their expressions unreadable from this distance. One by one, they left until I was alone with the lake and its impossible inhabitant. The silence that followed their departure was absolute. No bird calls, no wind in the trees, no insects buzzing in the warm afternoon air. Even the gentle lapping of water against the dock had ceased, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. It was then that I heard the voice. Not heard exactly. The words formed in my mind without passing through my ears, clear and unmistakable. "Come closer." My body moved before my conscious mind could object, scooting forward on the dock until my feet dangled inches above the water's surface. The shape below had risen, was now perhaps only 10 feet beneath me, close enough that I could make out details that my sanity struggled to process. It was vast beyond comprehension, what I could see being merely the upper portion of something that extended far deeper into the lake's depths. The appendages I had taken for arms were revealed to be tentacles of sorts, though they moved with a grace and purpose that suggested intelligence far beyond that of any earthbound cephalopod. "You have been calling to me," the voice continued, resonating through my skull like distant thunder. "Night after night, your dreams reach into my domain." The words triggered a flood of half-remembered nightmares. Dreams of dark water and vast shapes moving beneath the surface. Dreams that had been plaguing me since the divorce. Since I'd first begun considering this return to my father's favorite fishing spot. Dreams I had dismissed as stress-induced anxiety now revealed themselves as something else entirely. Summons. "I have been waiting," it continued, and I felt rather than saw its attention shift to the collection of lures weighing down my pockets. Each offering returned, each invitation extended. But you resist the final step. My legs felt like liquid, barely supporting my weight as I fought against the compulsion to slide forward, to let myself slip from the dock into those waiting depths. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to surrender to that call, to discover what lay beyond the veil of surface tension that separated my world from whatever realm this creature inhabited. But a smaller, more stubborn part of my mind clung to reality, to the knowledge that water meant drowning, that the depths held only death. "Not death," the voice corrected, apparently reading my thoughts as easily as I might read a book. "Transformation, union, the end of loneliness, the loneliness that hit closer to home than I cared to admit." Since Sarah's departure, the house had felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with the ghost of our failed relationship. I had eaten dinner alone, slept alone, woken to empty silence day after day. The fishing trips had been as much about escaping that crushing solitude as reconnecting with lost joy. "She never understood you." The presence continued, its voice taking on an almost sympathetic tone. "None of them do. But here in the deep places, understanding is unnecessary. Here, you need never be alone again." I found myself nodding, the gesture feeling natural despite its absurdity. The creature was right. Sarah had never understood my need for solitude, my preference for the quiet communion of fishing over loud social gatherings. She had called it antisocial, unhealthy, a symptom of depression rather than a legitimate choice. But this thing in the depths, it understood. It had been calling to me through my dreams, drawing me back to this place where understanding flowed as freely as the dark water itself. My hand moved toward the water, fingers extended, ready to break that final barrier between myself and whatever waited below. The surface tension held my reflection like a mirror, but it was wrong somehow, distorted. The face staring back at me was my own, but older, wearier, with eyes that held depths I didn't remember developing. "Yes," the voice whispered. "Urgent now. Cross over. Leave behind the world that wounds you." At the last moment, as my fingertips were about to touch the water, a sound broke through the supernatural silence, the distant rumble of a truck engine on the access road. Someone was coming. The spell shattered like glass. I jerked my hand back, suddenly aware of how close I had come to. What? Drowning, disappearing. The certainty that had filled me moments before evaporated, leaving only confusion and growing dread. The shape in the water recoiled as if burned, sinking back into the depths with a movement that spoke of rage and frustration. You will return." Its voice followed it down, fainter now, but no less certain. "You will return, and next time you will not resist." By the time the park ranger's truck came into view, the lake appeared normal once more, just dark water reflecting the late afternoon sky. I waved cheerfully at the ranger. My voice returned now that the creature had withdrawn, and made small talk about the fishing conditions. He seemed satisfied with my responses, noting only that I appeared to have caught nothing despite spending the entire day on the water. If only he knew what I had almost caught instead. The drive home passed in a blur of racing thoughts and growing terror. What had happened at the lake defied every rational explanation I could construct. Hallucinations brought on by stress and sleep deprivation seemed most likely, but the weight of lures in my pocket argued against that conclusion. They were real, tangible proof that something impossible had occurred. I pulled over twice to examine them, spreading the collection across my passenger seat. Every lure I had cast was there, each one completely dry and showing no signs of having been underwater. Even more disturbing, several lures were present that I didn't remember selecting. Designs I was certain I didn't own. Where had they come from that night? I sat at my kitchen table staring at the lures until well past midnight, searching for some rational explanation that refused to come. Eventually, exhaustion drove me to bed, where I lay staring at the ceiling until dawn, afraid to close my eyes and invite the dreams I knew would come. But they came anyway, seeping through the barriers of my conscious mind like water through a cracked foundation. Dreams of vast shapes moving through abyssal depths, of voices calling my name from places that existed beyond maps or understanding. And always, the certainty that something was waiting for my return. 3 days passed before I could bring myself to venture outside for more than essential errands. When I finally did, I found myself driving aimlessly through town, avoiding the roads that led toward the lake while unable to stop thinking about what waited there in the depths. Dr. Morgan's office offered no relief. When I tried to explain what had happened, carefully editing out the more impossible details, she nodded with professional sympathy and suggested adjusting my medication. Stress-induced hallucinations, she assured me, were more common than I might think, especially following major life changes. Her explanations should have been comforting. Instead, they felt like attempts to explain away something that demanded to be acknowledged, not dismissed. On the 4th night, the dreams changed. Instead of vague impressions of underwater realms, I found myself standing once again on that weathered dock. But now the water was crystal clear, revealing the full scope of what lay beneath. The creature was vast beyond imagination, its body extending down through fathoms of water that shouldn't have been possible in a lake I knew to be no more than 40 feet deep at its center. But depth, like so many other things, seemed negotiable in this place between waking and sleep. "You cannot stay away," it said, its voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Each day you remain in that hollow world above, you grow weaker. I offer strength. I offer purpose. I offer an end to the emptiness that consumes you." I woke with tears on my cheeks and the taste of lake water in my mouth. 2 weeks have passed since that first encounter, and I haven't returned to the lake. I tell myself I won't return. That whatever happened was a product of my fractured mental state and nothing more. I've thrown away the impossible lures, though they have a disturbing tendency to reappear in different pockets, different rooms, as if the lake is sending reminders of what awaits my return. Dr. Morgan has increased my sessions to twice weekly and added a new medication to my regimen. The dreams have diminished somewhat, though they haven't stopped entirely. Sometimes I catch myself staring at bodies of water, the decorative pond in the shopping center, the fountain in the town square, and wondering what might be looking back. The rational part of my mind insists that I'm recovering, that the crisis has passed and healing has begun. But rationality feels increasingly fragile these days, a thin shell surrounding something much darker and more complex. Because late at night, when the medication wears thin and sleep comes reluctantly, I can still feel it calling. Not just in dreams now, but in the spaces between heartbeats, in the silence that follows thunder, in the dark corners of rooms where shadows gather like pooled water. It's patient, this thing from the depths. It has time, more time than human minds can comprehend. It can wait for my resolve to weaken, for the loneliness to overwhelm my fear, for me to finally accept the invitation it continues to extend. The terrifying part isn't that it might be real. The terrifying part is that I'm not sure I want it to be anything else. Sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I find myself reaching for my car keys before catching myself, fingers frozen inches from metal, torn between the safety of denial and the terrible promise of understanding. How long can I resist? How long before the weight of ordinary existence becomes too much to bear? The lake knows the answer, even if I don't, it's waiting for me to figure it out. Story 11. The chainsaw's teeth had been silent for 3 days when I first heard her voice, threading through the Douglas firs like smoke through a keyhole. My mother had been dead for 15 years, buried beneath the granite headstone I'd carved myself from stone quarried in these same mountains. Yet there she was, calling my name from somewhere deep in the timber, where the old growth stretched their ancient arms toward a sky they'd never touch. I should have packed up my gear that first morning and driven the 40M back to town. Should have listened to the ice-cold certainty that crystallized in my gut the moment her voice drifted through the pre-dawn mist. Instead, I sat down my coffee mug with hands that trembled just enough to ripple the black surface, and I listened. The voice came again, soft and familiar as worn flannel, carrying the same cadence she'd used when I was small and afraid of thunder. It seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself had learned to speak with her tongue. My rational mind, the part that had spent 23 years felling timber, and knew the difference between wind through branches and something else entirely, insisted it was some trick of acoustics, a phantom born from isolation, and too many nights sleeping rough under canvas. But the part of me that remembered being 7 years old and sick with fever, the part that could still feel her cool palm against my burning forehead, knew better. The first time I heard it clearly enough to make out words. I was checking the tension on my saw chain. The sound came from the north, where the forest thickened into almost impenetrable stands of cedar and hemlock. Her voice carried that particular note of distress I remembered from childhood. Not panic, never panic, but the controlled urgency she'd used when I'd wandered too far from the house or stayed out past dark. "Thomas," she called, the syllables stretching like taffy in the humid air. "Thomas, I need you." I straightened so fast my back cracked, the saw chain forgotten in my oil-stained hands. The forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as if every bird and insect had collectively held its breath. Even the wind had stilled, leaving only the distant sound of my own heartbeat hammering against my eardrums. I called back, my voice cracking like a teenager's. The sound seemed to die just feet from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence that had settled over the woods like a shroud. No echo came back from the trees. No rustle of disturbed wildlife, just that crushing, expectant quiet. For the next hour, I tried to convince myself it had been my imagination. Isolation played tricks on the mind. Every logger knew that. Spend enough time alone in the deep woods and you'd start hearing things, seeing movement in your peripheral vision that wasn't there when you turned to look. It was normal, natural, nothing to worry about. But when her voice came again just before noon, closer this time, and tinged with what sounded like pain, I found myself walking toward it. The underbrush grew thicker as I moved north, away from the logging site where I'd been working. Ancient trees towered overhead, their canopies so dense that only scattered coins of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air grew cooler and somehow heavier, pressing against my chest with each breath. My boots made no sound on the thick carpet of decomposing needles, as if the earth itself was muffling my passage. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I realized I could no longer hear the highway in the distance. The constant background hum of traffic that had been my compass for the past week had vanished, leaving me surrounded by a silence so complete it seemed to have physical weight. My breathing sounded unnaturally loud, and I found myself holding my breath for long stretches just to avoid disturbing whatever invisible presence seemed to be watching from the shadows between the trees. The voice came again, and this time I was close enough to hear the tremor in it. "Please, Thomas, I'm trapped." The words seemed to come from a massive cedar about 50 yards ahead, its trunk easily 8 feet in diameter, and stretching up into the gloom like a pillar holding up the sky. As I approached, the sensation of being watched intensified until the hair on my arm stood on end, despite the humid air. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around, to run back to my truck and drive away from this place as fast as the old Ford would carry me. Instead, I pressed my palm against the bark and listened. The tree was singing. It was barely audible, more felt than heard. A subtle vibration that seemed to travel up through my arm and settle somewhere behind my sternum. The melody was achingly familiar, though it took me several long moments to place it. When recognition finally dawned, my knees nearly buckled. It was the lullaby my mother used to sing when I couldn't sleep. The one she'd hummed while braiding my hair or tending scraped knees, the same melody that had followed me into countless dreams, that I sometimes caught myself humming while working alone in the woods. The tree was singing my mother's lullaby, note for perfect note, as if the music itself had somehow grown into the wood grain. I snatched my hand away from the bark as if it had burned me, but the melody continued, growing slightly stronger. Other trees nearby began to join in. First a whisper, then a soft chorus that seemed to emanate from deep within their cores. The forest had become a concert hall, and I was the only audience to a performance that should have been impossible. My mother's voice came again, clearer now and definitely originating from within the massive cedar. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here." I backed away from the tree, my vision blurring at the edges. This wasn't possible. Dead people didn't get trapped inside trees. Timber didn't sing lullabies. But even as my rational mind rejected what I was experiencing, my body was already moving. Muscle memory guiding me back toward the logging site where I'd left my equipment. The walk back took forever and no time at all. I found myself stumbling through underbrush I didn't remember passing through, following game trails that seemed to appear and disappear at will. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had moved considerably across the sky, though I would have sworn I'd only been gone for an hour at most. My chainsaw started on the first pull, as if it too was eager to break the spell that had settled over the woods. I spent the rest of the day cutting, the roar of the engine drowning out any other sounds the forest might have been making. But even with the saw running full throttle, I could feel something watching me from the tree in, patient and implacable as stone. That night, I made camp closer to the road than usual, building my fire larger than necessary and feeding it constantly to keep the flames high. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed unusually dense, pressing in from all sides like black water. Every time a log shifted in the fire, sending sparks spiraling up into the night, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. Shapes that vanished when I turned to look directly at them. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of my mother's voice calling from deeper and deeper in the woods, always just out of reach. I would follow the sound through endless stands of timber, my feet sinking into forest floor that grew softer and more yielding with each step until I was wading through what felt like flesh rather than earth. The trees around me pulsed with their own rhythm, and I could hear music boxes playing from within their trunks. Dozens of them, hundreds, all playing the same lullaby in perfect impossible harmony. I woke before dawn with dirt under my fingernails and pine needles in my hair, though I was certain I'd never left my sleeping bag. The next day, her voice came earlier and more frequently. It followed me as I worked, always seeming to originate from whichever direction I wasn't facing. When I turned toward the sound, it would shift, leading me in slow circles around the logging site. By afternoon, I was jumping at every sound, my nerves stretched taut as piano wire. The smart thing would have been to pack up and leave. I'd finished the timber survey that had brought me here in the first place, and there was no reason to stay longer than necessary. But something kept me rooted to this patch of forest, some compulsion I couldn't name or resist. Every time I considered loading my gear into the truck, I would hear her voice again, closer than before and filled with such longing that my chest HDHD in response. On the third day, I went back to the cedar. The tree seemed larger than I remembered, its trunk stretching impossibly wide and tall. The lullaby was stronger, too. No longer just a vibration, but an actual melody that I could hear with my ears rather than feel with my bones. Other sounds had joined it. The soft tick-tick-tick of clockwork. The delicate chime of metal striking metal. It sounded like a music box, or rather dozens of music boxes, all playing the same tune from somewhere deep within the wood. My mother's voice came from directly in front of me, so clear and close that I reached out instinctively, expecting to find her standing there. "Cut me free, Thomas. Please, baby, cut me free." I found myself nodding, though part of my mind was screaming protests. This was madness. Trees didn't trap people. The dead didn't call out for rescue. But my hands were already reaching for the saw, my fingers wrapping around the familiar grip with practiced ease. The engine turned over on the second pull, settling into its comfortable growl. I advanced on the cedar, the saw held out in front of me like a shield. The closer I got, the louder the music became until the lullaby seemed to fill the entire forest. Birds erupted from the canopy overhead, fleeing the sound of the approaching blade. The first cut was always the hardest. The saw bit into bark that seemed thicker and more resistant than any I'd encountered before. Wood chips flew in strange patterns, some of them glinting in the filtered sunlight as if they contained flecks of metal. The smell was wrong, too. Not the clean, rainous scent of cedar, but something sweeter and more cloying, like flowers left too long in water. As the blade sank deeper, the music grew louder. I could hear individual instruments now, the plinking of tiny hammers striking tuned metal, the whisper of springs unwinding, the soft rustle of mechanical dancers spinning on miniature stages. It was beautiful and terrible and completely impossible. Halfway through the trunk, the saw hit something that wasn't wood. The blade caught and kicked, nearly jerking the saw from my hands. I shut off the engine and peered into the cut. There, embedded in the heartwood like an insect in amber, was the corner of something rectangular and metallic. I worked it free with my fingers, bark and sawdust falling away to reveal a tiny music box no larger than my palm. The lid was carved with intricate designs that seemed to shift and move when I wasn't looking directly at them. When I opened it, a miniature ballerina began to spin, her arms raised in perpetual pirouette as the familiar lullaby tinkled out in perfect crystalline notes. I snapped the lid shut, but the music continued, muffled now, but still audible. My hands were shaking as I set the music box aside and restarted the saw. The second cut revealed another box, this one slightly larger and decorated with what looked like tiny trees. The third cut yielded two more, their melodies joining the first in haunting harmony. By the time the cedar finally fell, I had pulled 17 music boxes from its trunk. They lay scattered around the base of the tree like offerings at an altar, each one playing the same lullaby my mother had sung to me 23 years ago. The fallen trunk was riddled with empty cavities where they had been embedded, giving the wood the appearance of honeycomb. But the music boxes weren't the most disturbing discovery. As I stood there surrounded by their tinkling melodies, I realized that each one was slightly different. The ballerina in the first box had my mother's face carved in miniature with impossible detail. The second contained a tiny figure of a woman in a rocking chair, her features unmistakably familiar. The third showed her hanging laundry on a line, her mouth open as if singing. Every music box contained a scene from my childhood, moments I hadn't thought about in years, but which were now displayed in perfect impossible detail. My mother braiding my hair. My mother reading to me by lamplight. My mother standing at the kitchen window. Her face turned toward the woods as if searching for something or someone. I picked up the largest of the music boxes. My hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. This one was different from the others, older somehow, its wood darker and more worn. When I opened the lid, no ballerina emerged. Instead, a tiny carved figure of a boy sat alone on a miniature bed, his hands pressed to his ears as if trying to block out some terrible sound. The boy had my face. As the lullaby played, I noticed something else. In the background of the scene, barely visible in the shadows of the carved bedroom, stood the figure of a woman. She was reaching toward the boy, her mouth open in what might have been song or scream. The music box slipped from my nerveless fingers, its melody cutting off abruptly as it hit the ground. In the sudden silence, I heard my mother's voice one last time. So close it seemed to whisper directly into my ear. "Now you're trapped, too." I spun around, expecting to see her standing behind me, but found only empty forest. The other music boxes had stopped playing, their clockwork mechanisms winding down to silence. The woods around me seemed different somehow. The trees taller and more closely spaced, the underbrush thicker. When I looked for the path I'd taken to reach the cedar, I couldn't find it. That was 3 hours ago, maybe 4. I'm not sure anymore. Time seems to move differently here, stretching and contracting like taffy in summer heat. I've been walking in what I think are circles, but every tree looks the same now, and my compass spins wildly no matter which direction I face. The music boxes are still with me, though I don't remember picking them up. They appear in my pockets when I check, their weight growing heavier with each step. Sometimes I hear them playing faint melodies that seem to come from inside my own chest. Sometimes I catch myself humming along. I can hear chainsaws in the distance now, growing closer, other loggers maybe, or search crews looking for me. But when I call out, my voice seems to die just inches from my mouth, swallowed by the oppressive silence that has settled over these woods like a blanket. The strangest part is that I'm not sure I want to be found anymore. There's something peaceful about being lost here. Something that feels like coming home after a long journey. The trees seem familiar now. Old friends welcoming me back. Sometimes I think I can see faces in their bark, worn smooth by wind and rain, but still recognizable, still singing. I found a comfortable spot to rest, a clearing where the canopy opens enough to let in shafts of golden sunlight. The music boxes are arranged in a circle around me, their lids open and their melodies weaving together in perfect harmony. The lullaby sounds different now. Not the simple tune my mother used to sing, but something richer and more complex. Layered with harmonies I never noticed before. It's beautiful. I think I'll stay here for a while. At least until the music stops, but I don't think it ever will. The trees are full of music boxes. Thousands of them. Millions maybe. All playing the same lullaby in an endless loop. All waiting for someone to come along and set them free. All waiting for someone to join them. The chainsaw sounds are getting closer now, but they don't sound quite right anymore. Too rhythmic, too musical, like clockwork mechanisms winding down, like music boxes playing their final notes before the spring uncoils completely. I should probably try to find my way out of here before dark, but my feet don't seem interested in moving. The music is so beautiful, so familiar, and I'm tired of being alone. There are worse places to be trapped, I suppose. Worse songs to have stuck in your head for eternity. At least the lullaby will help me sleep. Story 12. The first time I noticed it, I convinced myself it was a trick of the fluorescent lighting in my bathroom mirror. A faint burgundy smudge at the corner of my mouth, barely visible in the selfie I'd taken before bed. I wiped it away with the back of my hand and forgot about it until the next morning when I found the same photo saved to my phone with a timestamp of 3:17 a.m. long after I'd fallen asleep. Living above Mercy Chapel wasn't supposed to be permanent. The funeral director, Mr. Holloway, had offered me the small apartment as part of my internship package, claiming it would help me become more comfortable with the sacred nature of our work. Sacred. That's what he called it when I spent my evenings alone with the departed, applying foundation to grey skin and painting lips that would never speak again. The apartment was nothing more than a converted storage space with thin walls that did little to muffle the sounds from below, the whispered conversations of grieving families, the soft shuffle of footsteps on carpet, and sometimes late-at-night sounds I couldn't quite identify. The chapel sat on Elm Street, wedged between a defunct barber shop and a convenience store that closed at sunset. My windows faced the alley behind the building where dumpsters cast long shadows and stray cats moved like ghosts between the brick walls. The apartment itself was sparse: a bed, a kitchenette, a bathroom with a mirror that always seemed slightly fogged despite the lack of steam. But it was free, and free was all I could afford while learning the delicate art of making the dead look peaceful. Mrs. Holloway had been my first real case. Not the practice mannequins from mortuary school, but an actual person who had once laughed and cried and worried about mundane things like grocery lists and overdue bills. She'd requested a specific shade of lipstick in her will. Ruby Remembrance she'd called it. And her daughter had brought the tube in a trembling hand, explaining how her mother had worn it every Sunday to church for 30 years. I'd applied it carefully, my hand steadier than I'd expected for someone so new to the profession. The color transformed her face, brought a semblance of life to features that had grown slack and pale. When I finished, I cleaned my brushes meticulously, wiped down every surface, and washed my hands until the water ran cold. I'd learned early that proper cleanup wasn't just about hygiene. It was about respect, about leaving no trace of yourself on someone else's final appearance. That night, I'd taken my usual selfie. It had become a ritual of sorts, a way to prove to myself that I was still alive in a place surrounded by death. The photo showed my tired face against the dim light of my bedside lamp. But there on my lips was the unmistakable shade of ruby remembrance. I stared at the image for several minutes, my heart performing an irregular rhythm against my ribs. I must have missed a spot when cleaning up. That was the only logical explanation. Makeup could be stubborn, especially the long-wearing formulas designed to last through tears and time. I scrubbed my lips raw in the bathroom sink, watching burgundy swirls disappear down the drain, and told myself it wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again. And again, each morning brought a new discovery. Coral sunset from Mrs. Patterson, who'd insisted on looking bright and cheerful for her funeral. Dusty rose from the teenage girl whose family had chosen the color because it matched her prom dress. Deep plum from the elderly man whose wife had selected it because he'd always complimented her when she wore that shade. Colors I knew I'd removed completely. Colors that had no business being on my lips. Yet there they were in photo after photo, as if my sleeping self had applied them with careful precision. The worst part wasn't the lipstick itself. It was the timing. The photos were always taken between 3 and 4 a.m., always when I was certain I'd been asleep. I started staying awake deliberately, sitting in my bed with my phone in hand, waiting to catch myself in the act. But exhaustion would inevitably win, and I'd wake to find another image, another impossible color staining my mouth like evidence of a crime I couldn't remember committing. The chapel below grew busier as autumn settled over the town. More families, more services, more faces that needed my careful attention. I threw myself into the work, perfecting techniques for concealing bruises, learning to make sunken cheeks appear full again, mastering the art of creating expressions of peace where none had existed. Mr. Holloway praised my dedication, noting how I often stayed late to ensure everything was perfect. But perfection became an obsession tinged with dread. I began photographing my work, documenting each face before and after my ministrations. I told myself it was for my portfolio. But really, I was creating evidence, proof that I had cleaned everything properly, that no trace of color remained on my brushes or hands when I left the preparation room each evening. The photos showed my work was flawless, every tube of lipstick was capped and cleaned, every surface sanitized, every tool returned to its proper place. Yet still, the midnight selfies continued, each one more vivid than the last. The colors seemed to glow against my pale skin, as if lit from within by some source I couldn't identify. I started avoiding mirrors during the day, afraid of what I might see. The bathroom mirror, in particular, seemed to reflect things that weren't quite right, shadows that moved independently, colors that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. I told myself it was stress, that the isolated nature of my work was affecting my perception. Mortuary science instructors had warned us about the psychological toll, the way constant exposure to death could warp a person's sense of reality. But warped reality couldn't explain the phone calls. They started in November, always coming between 3 and 4 a.m., the same window when the mysterious photos appeared. My phone would buzz, displaying my own number as the caller ID. When I answered, I heard only silence, but not the empty silence of a deadline. This was the silence of someone listening, someone waiting on the other end of the connection. Sometimes I could swear I heard breathing that matched my own, as if I were somehow calling myself from another place entirely. I stopped answering after the 5th call, but they continued with mechanical persistence. Each morning, I'd find a voicemail waiting. Several minutes of that same listening silence, punctuated occasionally by sounds that might have been whispers or might have been static. I told myself it was a prank, some twisted joke from someone who knew about my strange living situation. But who would know? I told no one about the apartment above the chapel. Had no friends in this small town. No family who called regularly enough to notice my growing paranoia. The colors began bleeding into my waking hours. I'd catch glimpses of cherry bliss on the rim of my coffee cup, despite drinking only black coffee. Mauve memories would appear on tissues I'd used to clean my glasses, though I'd worn no makeup to smudge. Most disturbing were the traces I'd find on books I'd read. Perfect lip prints on pages I didn't remember kissing, as if some other version of me was going through the motions of my daily life, leaving behind these impossible signatures. I considered leaving, packing my few belongings, and returning to the city where mortuary school felt like a lifetime ago. But where would I go? This internship was my only path forward, my only chance to build a career in the field I'd chosen. And despite everything, the work itself continued to fulfill me. There was something sacred about helping families say goodbye, about ensuring their loved ones looked dignified and peaceful in their final moments. Each face I worked on was a story, a life reduced to the colors they'd chosen to wear into eternity. December brought a snowfall that muffled the sounds from the street below, making the chapel feel more isolated than ever. The heating system struggled to warm the old building, and I took to wearing layers even indoors. The cold seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the building were trying to match the temperature of its permanent residents. It was during this cold snap that I discovered the diary. I'd been cleaning out a supply closet when I found it wedged behind a box of embalming fluid. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages yellowed, but the handwriting inside was clear and deliberate. It belonged to someone named Marcus, who'd apparently worked in the chapel decades earlier. His entries chronicled a slow descent into what could only be described as madness, filled with references to borrowed colors and midnight obligations. Marcus wrote about finding lipstick on his lips each morning, about photos that appeared on his camera without his knowledge, about phone calls from his own number in the dead of night. The parallels to my own experience were too precise to be coincidental, too detailed to be explained away as similar psychological breaks under similar circumstances. His final entry, dated 3 months before the diary ended abruptly, contained a single line that made my hand shake as I read it. They want me to join them in their silence, but I refused to be still. I spent that night researching the chapel's history, using my phone's browser to dig through local newspaper archives and property records. What I found chilled me more than the December air seeping through my windows. The chapel had seen dozens of employees over the decades, most staying only a few months before leaving without explanation. Several had been found in states of psychological distress, claiming to have lost time, to have done things they couldn't remember. One man had been discovered wandering the cemetery at dawn, his lips painted in a shade that matched no living person's cosmetics, speaking in whispers about giving back what was borrowed. The next morning, I called Mr. Holloway to request a meeting. I needed to understand what was happening. Needed answers that might preserve what remained of my sanity. He agreed to see me after the chapel closed that evening, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd been expecting this conversation. Mr. Holloway was waiting in his office when I arrived, the overhead lights casting deep shadows across his lined face. He gestured for me to sit, then poured 2 glasses of something amber from a bottle he kept in his desk drawer. I accepted the drink, though I rarely touched alcohol, needing something to steady my nerves for the conversation ahead. He listened without interruption as I described everything. The photos, the phone calls, the colors that appeared where they shouldn't exist. When I finished, he nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd long suspected. The chapel chooses its own, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Some people are more receptive to the needs of those we serve, the colors you've been wearing. They're not just makeup. They're the final wishes of souls who aren't quite ready to let go of the world they knew. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss his words as the rambling of an old man who'd spent too many years around death. But the weight of everything I'd experienced pressed down on me, making disbelief impossible. The diary, the history, the impossible precision of each mysterious application. It all pointed to something beyond conventional explanation. Marcus, I said, remembering the diary. What happened to him? Mr. Holloway's expression darkened. Marcus tried to fight it. He thought he could resist, could somehow break free from what the chapel was asking of him. But you can't refuse the dead when they've chosen you as their vessel. They're not malicious. They simply want to be remembered, to have their final beauty acknowledged one more time. But the phone calls, the photos taken while I'm sleeping. You're not sleeping during those hours. He interrupted gently. You're serving. Your conscious mind steps aside and something deeper takes over. It's an honor, really, though I understand it doesn't feel that way. I stared at him, my rational mind rebelling against every word. Yet, as I sat there, I became aware of a strange tingling in my lips. A warmth that seemed to spread from within. I touched my mouth instinctively and felt the familiar texture of lipstick, though I'd applied none that day. Mr. Holloway smiled sadly. Tonight will be different. You'll remember now that you know what's happening. The chapel has decided you're ready for the full truth. I left his office feeling as if I were floating, disconnected from my own body. The stairs to my apartment seemed longer than usual, each step echoing in a way that suggested vast spaces beyond the narrow stairwell. My reflection in every surface I passed showed lips painted in a color I'd never seen before. A shade that seemed to shift between purple and black depending on the angle of the light. Once in my apartment, I sat on my bed and waited. The clock on my nightstand ticked toward 3 a.m. with mechanical persistence, each second bringing me closer to whatever revelation awaited. I wasn't afraid anymore, which should have frightened me more than anything else I'd experienced. The fear had been replaced by a strange anticipation, as if I were about to reunite with old friends. At exactly 3:17 a.m., I felt my hand reaching for my phone without conscious direction. My fingers moved across the screen with practiced ease, opening the camera application and positioning it for a selfie. But this time, I was aware of every movement, every deliberate action my body was performing. Through my own eyes, I watched myself smile for the camera. My lips painted in that impossible shifting color. But the smile wasn't mine. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had worn the shade in life and now borrowed my mouth to wear it again. As the camera clicked, I felt a presence settle over me like a comfortable coat, ancient and patient and infinitely grateful. The photo appeared on my screen, but it wasn't my face looking back. It was the face of everyone I'd ever prepared for their final rest. All of them wearing their chosen colors. All of them smiling with quiet contentment. They flickered through the image one by one, a slideshow of souls who had found a way to be beautiful again, if only for a moment. My phone began to ring, my own number appearing on the display. This time, when I answered, I heard my own voice speaking words I hadn't planned to say. Thank you for letting us remember what it felt like to be lovely. I understood then that I wasn't losing my mind. I was sharing it, becoming a living gallery for those who had no other way to display their final vanity. The chapel had chosen me not as a victim, but as a curator, someone who could preserve and present the beauty that death tried to steal. As dawn approached, I looked in my bathroom mirror one last time. My reflection showed my own face again, clean of any makeup, but my eyes held depths that hadn't been there before. I was still myself, but I was also something more. A keeper of final wishes, a guardian of last desires. I've been living above Mercy Chapel for 6 months now, and I've learned to embrace my midnight obligations. Each night, I serve as canvas for souls who aren't ready to let go of their earthly beauty. And each morning, I wake with the satisfaction of having honored their memory. The photos continue to appear on my phone, but now I save them carefully, creating an album of borrowed beauty that grows more precious with each edition. Sometimes when I'm working on a new client during the day, I catch glimpses of recognition in their still faces, as if they know I understand their final vanity, their desire to be remembered as they were in their most beautiful moments. I apply their chosen colors with extra care, knowing that someday they might return to wear them again through me. The phone calls still come, but now I recognize the voices on the other end. Whispered thanks from those I've helped. Promises from others who are waiting their turn. Mr. Holloway was right. It is an honor, though, one that comes with a price I'm only beginning to understand. Last night, I found a new diary in the supply closet. This one bound in fresh leather with blank pages waiting to be filled. I've started writing my own entries, documenting the colors and faces and midnight transformations that have become my life. Someday another intern will find this diary, just as I found Marcus, and they'll learn that the chapel chooses its own. That some of us are meant to be living museums for the beauty that death cannot quite claim. Tonight, as I prepare for sleep, I can already feel the familiar tingling in my lips, the gentle pressure of someone waiting to borrow my smile. I don't know whose color I'll wear, whose final wish I'll fulfill, but I'm ready to serve as their mirror, their last chance to be seen and remembered and beautiful. The chapel is quiet below me, filled with its permanent residents and their patient dreams. But I know that at 3:17 a.m. some of them will wake long enough to remember what it felt like to be lovely. And I'll be here to help them remember one borrowed color at a time.